Chapter 959. The dreadful crashing sounds rang out on the surface of the planet. Every crashing sound was the result of the cute little fist breaking the void. The dark night in the void represented the will of the sea of dark matter. The snow girl's fist represented the will of the universe. The collision of the two powerful wills created huge waves on the ocean of snow and collapsed countless mountains and rivers on the ground. The dark night kept moving backward, leaving the ground and returning to the same dark universe. 9 black suns were forced to show themselves from the dark night, retreating toward the distant atmosphere. On the basketball court, Huashi covered her ears and yelled excitedly while looking at the white cracks spreading in the dark night. However, the wind and snow on the surface of the planet were too strong and the temperature was too low, so her voice couldn't reach the outside world. Sitting on the grand nirvana with the Buddha fire on his fingers, the joyful monk sensed the energy of the tearing space at the edge of the atmosphere. He felt both delighted and a bit perplexed, as he thought that the emperor had grown many times stronger after so many years, and he couldn't keep up with her even if he wanted to. The snowy lines fell on the dark night. They were moving, but the temperature was close to absolute zero, which was on the verge of violating the rules of this world. Each of the little fists had the power to break the void, which was something only a god could achieve. The snow girl was indeed the strongest swordsman in this world, but she wasn't as powerful as she was now when she was in Chaotian. It would take her some effort to kill the fairy lady Byron. How come she had become so powerful now? The cultivation practitioners who had ascended from Chaotian to this world had an endless supply of fairy energy, so they would grow stronger much faster than before. What did she rely on then? The endless cold intent in the vast universe? The problem was that the fairy energy could be understood as photons, but the cold intent didn't have a specific existence. It was merely a description of the motion of the particles, not the particles themselves. So how could it provide a specific support? It was truly a difficult problem to understand. Countless little fists landed on the dark night like the snowflakes, bringing the dark domain of thousands of square kilometers out of the atmosphere and into the space, blocking the permanent star in the distance. Foggy City grew darker, as if it were a solar eclipse. This was the first scene that Jing Jiu saw when he opened his eyes. He felt that he had seen it somewhere before. This thought indicated that he might have recalled something. Looking at Huashi nearby, he thought that he would do the same thing even if he could go back in time. Time was difficult to reverse, and space was easy to shatter. That black domain cracked open like colored glass. The space curled up and then retracted, turning into countless fragments. The sun shone on the earth again. The 9 virgins hovered quietly at the edge of the atmosphere, illuminated by the light of the star. Their figures appeared even more terrifying. Accompanied by the evil aura of nirvanic destruction, the highest-ranked brood mothers were prepared to obliterate that snow-like figure. Shuejie did not give them any chance. She turned around from the shard of black domain and charged at the nearest dark one. Her speed was unimaginably fast, leaving a straight line of snow in the extremely thin air. It looked as if someone had drawn a line on a blackboard with white chalk. With a light smack, her little fist ignored the thick, viscous, and almost tangible aura of darkness. Like a dandelion blown by the wind, it brought down countless huge tentacles and landed on the surface of the virgin's body. This punch was extremely light and did not have any power, but it carried an unimaginable amount of chill, a chill that was close to absolute zero. The spot where the little fist landed produced a flower made of ice crystals, which spread rapidly to the surroundings of the virgin's body and soon occupied the entire area. In an instant, the deathly energy exuded by the virgin's great power vanished without a trace, and those tentacles stopped waving, becoming stiff like the ice shards. This dreadful brood mother of the highest state had been frozen solid. The absolute zero was the limit of the physical rules in this world, meaning that all the particles would stop moving and all the motions would cease to exist. Everything would return to quietness, like what happened before the beginning of the universe or after death. The virgins carried the will of the sea of dark matter and possessed an unimaginably destructive and strong consciousness, but they had no way to resist the small fist of the snow girl. It was because they were in this world and had no choice but to obey the rules of this world. As the huge tentacles broke into pieces in the atmosphere, the snow girl had gone to another place thousands of kilometers away. At the end of the snowy line was an even uglier huge broodmother. The funny-looking fleshy wing broke into pieces, and the broodmother turned into another frozen pear. Pa! 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 Dozens of straight snowy lines appeared in the atmosphere, forming a pattern resembling a six-pointed star. Where the lines of the pattern intersected, the 9 virgins entered a dormant state, turning into huge and ugly ice balls. When the dark area was shattered by the small fist of the snow girl, some of the virgins intended to explode themselves, and some of them, who had never known fear and retreat, intended to tear open the space and leave, but they had no way to escape from the net formed by these lines. The 9 frozen huge broodmothers hovering by the edge of the atmosphere didn't give off any energy, and it was unclear if they were truly dead. Looking at the 9 broodmothers in the high sky, Hua Shi remarked, "They look like frozen pears." Jingjiu remembered that the water droplets on the surface of the frozen pears on the windowsill looked nice under the sunlight. "They are the stomachs," he said while shaking his head. To put it more precisely, they were the stomachs of the untreated cows that had just been taken out from the ice chamber. Some of the stomachs were bulging, and some were slightly shriveled. They had different shapes, but they were essentially the same. Jingjiu thought of the stomachs of cows not because he had learned the relevant knowledge in the interest class, and it had nothing to do with the knowledge he had memorized on the Star Zone network. It was because he, Lu Ci, and Yuan Qijing hadn't been qualified to ask Shuriwe Peak to prepare the hot pot many years ago when they ate at the Shanghai Peak. Though he couldn't remember the hot pot and those people, he could remember the ingredients clearly. The snow girl returned to the basketball court along with the drifting snowflakes. She looked as gentle as the snowflakes. The whole ground quaked, and the nearby computer room collapsed with a loud crash. It was unclear if the alloy door of the underground base would be deformed more severely. The expression in her eyes was as nonchalant as usual, and her 2 small hands were folded behind her back. It seemed that she didn't consume much energy, and she simply flew in the sky. The joyous monk was the only one who noticed some details. Her hair was not as white as snow as it had been in the past. It was a bit translucent, and a tiny thread could be vaguely seen in each strand of hair. More importantly, a few beads of sweat appeared on her round face. The few beads of sweat meant something important. In order to tear apart the dark realm and freeze the 9 black suns with the absolute zero, she had paid a great deal. She wasn't as nonchalant as she appeared to be. She must have been exhausted to the extreme. This battle was undoubtedly the most important one after the final battle between the god of the distant ancient civilization and the sea of dark matter. In terms of grandeur, it could only be compared to the destruction of the planet by the sword formation of Aoyama with thousands of battleships as swords and thousands of battleships. The entire planet's surveillance equipment had been destroyed. Other than the 3 people on the basketball court, no one else could see the battle. Otherwise, they would be shocked at how easily Shuejiai won. The whole process was so simple that they couldn't even believe it. The question was, did the battle really end just like that? "They are not dead yet," said the joyous monk. "Those dark ones at the edge of the atmosphere were still alive." To put it more precisely, they were dead to begin with. How could they die again? Though the space was cold, there was always energy. The state of being extremely close to the absolute zero couldn't be maintained for too long, and they would wake up again. The snow girl was well aware of the current state of those ugly mother nests. She ignored the joyous monk and turned to look at Jingjiu. There was no wariness or uneasiness in her black pupils, save for a calm and undeniable will. It was an invitation. It was the same as when Lu Ci looked at his young senior master gloomily while sitting on the high mountain and stepping on the low ocean of clouds many years ago, sighing. It was also an invitation. The Snow Girl had invited Jingjiu once before she ascended. The meaning of this invitation was, "Please be my sword." This was what Jingjiu feared the most in his life. It was only when Lu Ci said, "Please," in front of countless cultivation sects and Nan Chu when the West Ocean was in a desperate situation that Jingjiu reluctantly agreed to the invitation. As a result, the great grandmaster of the Foggy Island, Nan Chu, died. Jian Shilai lost his first arm. The mysterious dark sect and Wang Xiaoming, whose name he had almost forgotten, were annihilated together. The muddy water in 10,000 miles turned red overnight. Only the sect master of Aoyama could employ the all-in-one sword by employing the inherited heaven sword style. It was truly a coincidence. The Snow Girl could do it as well. He had taught her in the 3,000 nunnery outside Diyuan City. Many years had passed. On this planet full of abandoned factories, Jingjiu faced the monsters of the sea of dark matter hovering at the edge of the atmosphere. Jingjiu had received the invitation again, and he had sensed the intention of the Snow Girl. However, he had no idea what was going on at the moment, so he nodded casually. Over the last year, the Snow Girl had often asked him to play chess or zither with her eyes. He had never refused her invitation, or in other words, he didn't dare refuse her invitation. It had become a habit. The force of habit was exceedingly powerful. It had even overcome his instinctive fear. A peculiar glint flashed in the Snow Girl's eyes. She didn't expect him to agree so easily. She reached out her small, round hand and grabbed Jingjiu's hand. Jingjiu was bewildered, and he had no intention of pulling his hand back. The Snow Girl was delighted after making sure that she had caught Jingjiu's hand. The two ends of the red line on her round face curled up slightly. Buzz! The red cloth danced in the wind. It didn't look like a battle flag, but more like a sword that had been wrapped around it being lifted off. A bright sword light illuminated the basketball court and the wall full of scratches, and then illuminated the entire foggy city and all the corners between heaven and earth. This sword light had appeared at the West Ocean, at the scorching sun gorge, and in the muddy water, and today it appeared on the full moon planet. It took the Snow Girl merely a dozen seconds to learn the inherited heaven sword style at the 3,000 nunnery, but her inherited heaven sword style was not inferior to that of any of the sect masters of Aoyama. In fact, it was even stronger. It was because her talent was much stronger than that of all the human cultivation practitioners. What kind of power would the all-in-one sword in her hand display? Nobody could see it. It was because the sword light was exceedingly bright, many times brighter than the distant permanent star. The indistinguishable snow and ash on the ground rose up along with the Snow Girl's figure and turned into countless swords under the illumination of the sword light. The most extreme coldness and the purest sword will were hidden in those swords. It was as if the sword formation of Aoyama had reappeared. The bright sword light came to the edge of the atmosphere and passed through a virgin dark one. There was no sound, but some black and ash-like things splashed out from the gap on the surface of the giant mother nest like flowers. Immediately afterward, the sword light pierced through the other 8 giant hives, leaving a continuous line in the sky. End of this chapter. Chapter 960. The gentle wind blew over the basketball court again. The snow and ashes left the ground and came to a height of 100 meters in the air along with the sword wills, and then dropped down slowly. The Snow Girl landed and released Jingjiu's hand slowly. Despite her prowess, she felt a bit reluctant the moment she let go of Jingjiu's hand. Though they were both in the invincible state, it felt more satisfying to wield the all-in-one sword and kill everything. Her hair was completely wet, and the beads of sweat on her face had turned into a river, dripping to the ground by her feet. The joyful monk took out a handkerchief from the Grand Nirvana and handed it to her. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of worry. Just as he had thought, Sweating was a normal loss for ordinary humans, but it was an extremely rare thing for cultivators. Since it had appeared on Shuejiai's body, it showed that the sword strike from before had caused her to suffer an extremely severe loss. The snow girl had no intention of taking the handkerchief. She reached out her hand expressionlessly and was about to take back the red cloth, but she found that there was nothing there. The red cloth had been burned to powder in the atmosphere a long time ago. Standing by the side of the snow girl, Jingjiu looked at the sword light in the sky that hadn't completely dissipated, feeling bewildered, not knowing what had just happened. Seeing her brother's pitiful appearance, Huashi was worried that he might have caught a cold, so she took out some clothes from her luggage and handed them to him. She followed Jingjiu's line of sight and looked at the sky. "They look like fireworks," she remarked with an admiring expression on her small face. The snow girl turned her head around and shot a glance at her, saying nothing. Jingjiu had taken a glance at Huashi after he had woken up earlier. He didn't know what it meant. The 9 virgins by the edge of the atmosphere died. They died for real this time, even though they were dead in the first place. In other words, they had lost the foundation of their existence, and were turning into the most basic particles. The moment the sword light entered their bodies, the state of absolute ice was broken. They woke up and chose to explode themselves immediately. However, the erupting death energy and mental attacks were all sliced into pieces by the sword light, leaving only a great deal of air currents behind. The all-in-one sword held by the snow girl could cut everything into pieces. The death of those people in the dark was quite normal for the 2 strongest swordsmen in Chaotian to join hands. The scene after their death was magnificent, which was worthy of their status and the dreadfulness of the sea of dark matter. The huge mother nest disintegrated at the edge of the atmosphere, and the space it occupied was quickly filled up. The terrifying aura instantly disappeared, even causing space to distort. The distant star and the thousands of stars that could be vaguely seen would be strongly refracted when they passed through those spaces. 9 beautiful halos appeared in the sky above the planet. The rubble of the old moon that was slowly falling to the surface of the planet in the distance was bounced up by the waves emitted by the distorted space. The unimaginable number of quietus particles formed 9 invisible particle winds that blew the rubble even further away. Who knew how many tens of thousands of years it would take for the remaining particles of the Dark One to completely disappear? Who knew what kind of trouble it would leave behind? Shuejiai stretched out her cute little round hand and snapped her fingers. Not far away, in Building 720, the little tabby cat, who was lying on a soft chair and staring curiously at the ball of sword fire, was startled, because the light in the living room was turned on. Many other rooms in the building also lit up, forming an irregular picture. The row of birch trees behind the flower bed was illuminated a bit more brightly. The atmosphere grew brighter as well. The particle winds that the 9 Dark One had turned into after their death drifted away from the planet and headed toward the distant sun. It wouldn't take long for them to arrive there and be burned into nothingness by the endless light and heat. By now, all the monsters from the Sea of Dark Matter had been killed by the Shuejiai and Jingjiu, but it was not over yet. The crack in space was still there, and a great deal of shapeless and invisible dark energy remained on the planet. Both the sword fire and the Buddha fire could remove the dark energy, but it was evident that Jingjiu and the merry monk couldn't do it yet. The Shuejiai shot them a glance, like a teacher looking at useless students. She closed her eyes tiredly, exuding a great deal of cold intent as she spread to various places on the surface of the planet. Huashi shuddered reflexively. As she was about to ask the young monk to make more fire, she suddenly found her vision blacked out. As she saw the light again, she found herself in the ruins of a strange factory. There was a crack in space not far away, extremely dark and gloomy, like the deepest abyss, which could strike fear into any intelligent being. Her face was pale, and she grabbed the corner of Jingjiu's cloth reflexively. The Shuejiai was of course not afraid. Noticing her fear, She shot a glance at Jingjiu for some reason. Hua Shi calmed down a bit. She looked around and found that one person was missing. Where is that monk? She asked curiously. The Shuejie didn't answer her question. She walked to the front of the crack in space and reached out her small round hand. It was evident that she had left the merry monk there on purpose. A flash of golden light suddenly appeared in the distant sky, followed by a hurried shout. Your Majesty, please wait a moment. Many Dai Su and Banwei who had been killed by the Buddha light last night were lying in the ruins of the factory. They had lost their colors and looked like statues made of white rocks. A pair of bare feet stepped down and crushed a dead Dai Su. The merry monk looked at the Shuejie and said solemnly, Your Majesty, please allow me to go with you. The Shuejie didn't heed him. She released a cold energy from her small hand. The cold wind whistled, and the breath turned into ice. Hua Shi hid behind Jingjiu and hugged him through the blue tracksuit, feeling a bit warmer. It didn't take long before the crack in space was blocked by the ice. The ice was not made of water. It was unclear what it was, but it was very strong and could serve as a barrier between the two worlds. This was not the true melting of the space, so it couldn't last for a long time. But it could stop the dark energy from flowing in. When the fleet of the Federation of the Milky Way and those human ascendants arrived, the melting could be carried out slowly. What the Saint Xingju and the merry monk had to do at the risk of their lives was merely a matter of waving her hand for the Shuejie. Seeing this, the merry monk was astonished, not because of the Emperor's means, but because she was still in this world. How could they go to the sea of dark matter if the crack in space was blocked up? He thought that the Emperor had finally subdued the all-in-one sword that day and accomplished the purpose of hiding on this planet. Next, the Emperor would go to the sea of dark matter and make those monsters submit to him and become the king of that territory. As such, he came here in a hurry and said that he wanted to go with the Shuejie. But it seemed that the Emperor didn't have such an intention. The Shuejie walked toward the outside of the ruins of the factory expressionlessly after uttering a groan. The merry monk understood what she meant, his face turning as pale as a piece of paper. Jingjiu also understood what she meant and knew that the Shuejie was annoyed. He nodded to the merry monk and followed behind the Shuejie while holding Hua Shi's hand. Jingjiu didn't know who the merry monk was, thinking that he was a passerby who happened to pass by the basketball court. They met by chance, so there was no need for them to go together. The merry monk's Zen mind was in a mess, and he couldn't accept such a thing. He reached out his hand reflexively to the Shuejie's shoulder in an attempt to stop her. The Shuejie turned around and looked at him in silence. The merry monk sensed a strong danger and drew back his right hand slowly. He moved the prayer beads in his left hand slightly, and the Grand Nirvana appeared in front of him. The Shuejie's little hand smashed on the Grand Nirvana, and it was like beating a drum, making a loud bang. A bolt of cold lightning appeared in the ruins of the factory. The merry monk groaned and knelt on the ground. Dust flew up from his knees like arrows. Fortunately, he had the protection of the Grand Nirvana, and he had cultivated the indestructible golden body. Otherwise, he would have been smashed by the Shuejie's punch. Even so, his knees and feet had sunk into the ground. The Shuejie smashed her fist down again. Boom, 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 boom. It was like the ringing of a bell. A dozen little fists directly smashed the ancestor of Zen deep into the ground. With a loud bang, the remaining ruins of the factory were shaken and collapsed. Hua Shi walked to the side of the hole and curiously stuck her little face out to look down. She found that the hole was too deep and she couldn't see anything. Jingjiu recalled that day, and his expression was a little unnatural. That day, he lost to that annoying kid in the Space Army chess at the Activity Center. After returning home, he was specially trained by the Shuejie, and the scene was similar to this. He looked at the Shuejie and felt that she was a little different from usual. Her punches that landed on the Grand Nirvana did not really use any strength. A punch that could shatter the black domain could probably pierce through this planet with one punch. And since a few days ago, she had been looking at somewhere in the void. Could it be that she knew this young monk before? The Shuejiai jumped up. Hua Shi let go of the corner of Jingjiu's clothes and carried him out of the factory ruins. Jingjiu glanced at the hole, shook his head, and also walked out of the ruins. The three of them walked out of the ruins. Snow fell from the sky again. After an unknown period of time, the sudden arrival of the snow suddenly disappeared. Their traces had also disappeared in the field, and no one knew where they went. End of this chapter. Chapter 961. The permanent star shone on the planet, and the temperature in the atmosphere rose gradually. The water droplets gradually appeared on the surface of the frozen ponds and streams. As long as this trend was maintained, the temperature on the surface of the planet would return to normal one day, and the icy sea would become a vast ocean again. As long as there was water, there would be clouds, and there would be rain. The rain falling on the surface of the planet would wash the gray crystals of the corpses of the monsters into the bottom of the ocean. Yet, it would be a long time before it happened. 2 days later, the temperature on the surface of the full moon planet had risen to 60 degrees below zero. Some special military chips had survived the severe cold and started collecting the information of the surroundings with the help of the self-generating and thermal micro-devices. Some satellites outside the atmosphere had also survived the cold. The ice and frost on the surface of the planet had gradually melted. They started receiving the signals from the surface of the planet and then sent them to the deep part of the universe. Both the scorching sun battleship and the distant ancestral star were shocked by the vast expanse of white snow when they saw the moongazer again. Then, they were even more shocked to find that the 9 virgins at the edge of the atmosphere had disappeared without a trace. What had happened in the final battle? Countless orders were sent to the full moon planet. The scorching sun battleship and the fleet led by Chen Yi sped up. Though they traveled at the highest speed and couldn't go any faster, the excitement and nervousness still pervaded the thousands of battleships. The satellites had scanned the planet many times and ascertained that there were no monsters of the sea of dark matter on the surface of the planet. In the end, the remaining projecting devices released a large number of cockroaches, but they didn't detect any dark energy. Hundreds of unmanned armors broke through the heavy ice cover and walked out from the underground bases, starting to investigate the situation on the ground. Dozens of unmanned armors arrived at the ruins of the factory as quickly as they could. They ascertained that the monsters of the sea of dark matter were all dead. Their corpses and dark energy were turned into the tiniest ice crystals by an unimaginably mysterious force, and the crack in the space in the ruins of the factory was blocked by the same mysterious force. The crisis on the full moon planet had been resolved, and it was done cleanly. Receiving the news transmitted from the ground by the unmanned armors, thousands of underground bases broke out in cheers. After the cheers, they felt bewildered. Had the invasion of the sea of dark matter come to an end? The 9 million populace felt ecstatic at having survived the calamity, but they were also at a loss. The temperature on the surface of the planet was still very cold. To ensure safety, more scans and inspections were needed. Most of the facilities were completely destroyed in that unimaginable cold wave. Humans could not survive in such an environment. The people could not leave the underground for the time being. They might have to stay underground for dozens of days or even longer. But with a goal in mind, what was a few years? This night was even more relaxing than any of the previous nights. People walked out of their respective safe houses and came to the circular square. They watched the news on the light screen, greeted their neighbors with smiles, and passed fruits and other food to each other. Ms. Eve had just finished her work. Looking at the scene in front of her, she could not help but curl her lips into a sincere smile. Then, she thought of the young man who left last night and thought in a daze, "Ryan, is all this really related to you?" 5 days later, Chow Yuan arrived at the Scorpion Tail Nebula from the distant Buddha land on a seemingly ordinary but actually very fast pirate spaceship. The Sky-Fire industrial base was no longer burning, and the space crack looked gloomier and colder, resembling the eye of a demon. The space crack had shrunk a lot after being eroded by a dozen ascendants, but it was still about 500 meters wide. The rest of the ascendants had been taken to the full moon planet by Chen Ye to kill the Snow Girl and Jingjiu. The fairy swordsman En Xing hadn't recovered from his severe injury yet, so it was a bit difficult for him to deal with the matter alone. Having learned the situation, Chow Yuan didn't hesitate to obtain the high-level authority of the military through Tsingju and invite the fairy swordsman En Xing back from the Sky-Fire industrial base. Chow Yuan took over the eroding equipment from En Xing and started mending the space crack. The melting of the cracks in the space had to withstand an unimaginably high temperature. Even the fairy bodies of the ascendants couldn't withstand it. The most suitable bodies were Shen Yunmai's body, Jingjiu's and the joyous monk's indestructible golden body. Coincidentally, Chow Yuan was also one of them. In the dark space, on the planet that was getting colder, a golden Buddha held the eroding equipment and shot out an unimaginably high-temperature torrent of light and heat toward the empty space. The scene was quite a thrilling one. He was aware that something had happened on the full moon planet, but he didn't pay much attention to it. What was similar to the current Jingjiu was that he was used to doing things on a single track. However, Jingjiu's brain was out of order, and he did it on purpose. He didn't do it to avoid it, but he hadn't thought it through yet. Since he couldn't think it through, he decided to do something that didn't require him to think about it, like eroding the space crack. In any case, someone had to do it, and no one could do it better than him. Many philosophers and artists would put down the books in their hands and stop thinking when they encountered some obstacles. They would chop firewood, run, cook, or visit prostitute. It was the same as what he was doing now. Chow Yuan hadn't put down the eroding spear since the moment he picked it up. His golden body grew hotter and emitted a red glow. It was obvious that he was having a hard time holding it up. Yet, he didn't say anything, and his countenance didn't even change. The fairy swordsman En Xing couldn't stand it anymore, saying, "Little monk, let me do it." "Senior master, you're too slow." "Let me do it," said Chow Yuan. Many monsters of the Sea of Dark Matter had escaped from this space crack. Though En Xing and the happy monks had killed many of them had escaped. Those monsters were drifting toward a galaxy in the space. More than 100,000 humans in this galaxy had been evacuated by the battleships, so they didn't have to worry about the invasion of a larger area. However, Chow Yuan still intended to go there to finish the cleanup after he had eroded the space crack. Normally, the task of eroding the cracks in the space and cleaning up the monsters of the Sea of Dark Matter were very important, so he couldn't take care of them alone. However, the problem was that all the swordsmen and battleships of the Federation of the Milky Way were on their way to the moon-gazing planet. It was like what Chen Ye had said. For many people, the collaboration of the Snow Girl and Jingjiu was even more dreadful than the invasion of the Sea of Dark Matter. Was it ridiculous? The space passages on the full moon planet leading to other planets had been blocked by the Star Fleet and the Star Chain Fleet. The Scorching Sun battleship, which was the first to arrive on the full moon planet, hovered in the space tens of millions of kilometers away in silence, releasing many detectors to track the flow of the dark particles and ensure that they would continue on their way to the permanent star instead of drifting to other places. A dozen military spaceships landed on the surface of the planet full of ice and snow, causing countless snowstorms. The cabin door of the spaceship opened, and Tsingju flew out from it and landed slowly on the ground. Jiang Zhixing and the other soldiers and the researchers from the 857 base flew out from the spaceship wearing the isolation mechas. Though they had confirmed that there were no living monsters of the sea of dark matter on the surface of the planet after many scans and detections, it was hard to say if there were any spores or remnants of dark energy hiding in the corners of the planet. For the sake of safety, the people who came to the surface of the planet would have to adopt the highest level of isolation measures for at least 10 days. I don't think it's a problem. But those cockroaches that have been scattered over the last few days are still alive. The people on this planet will be in trouble in the future. The voice of an advisor rang out in the communication system, followed by a wave of cheerful laughter. They were still in the mood to joke at the moment, indicating that they were all in a relaxed mood. The invasion of the Sea of Dark Matter had been dealt with, and the full moon planet had escaped from the catastrophe. The Scorching Sun battleship didn't have to worry about becoming a vagrant in the space. According to the reports of the detectors in the planetary system, the flow of particles turned into by the 9 dark ones didn't deviate from the direction they were heading. They would land on the surface of the permanent star in a few days. When the soldiers on the Scorching Sun battleship volunteered to come to the rescue, they didn't expect that the disaster would have such a perfect ending. The mechas on the snowy ground looked up at the sky reflexively, but the 9 high-level mother hives had already disappeared without a trace. Normally, if the monsters of the level of the Dark Ones fought with the swordsmen of the human race, the result would be either earth-shattering or earth-shattering. It was even possible for the planet to be destroyed, but it was impossible for the situation to end up like this. The surface of the planet was covered with ice and snow, and the atmosphere was exceedingly clean. The traces of a battle could be seen on the ground occasionally, but they were not as severe as regular earthquakes. Heaven and earth were as tranquil as the aftermath of an ancient battle. What did this mean? It didn't mean that the 9 dark ones were weaker than they had imagined. It was that the Snow Girl was more powerful than they had imagined. Xingju thought in silence that the Emperor was indeed too powerful. Fortunately, the god must have left a way to control her. Otherwise, the Federation of the Milky Way would have to live under her shadow forever like the human dynasties in Chaotian. Perhaps the god had never thought that the Snow Girl would be able to leave Chaotian. The ruins of the factory ahead had collapsed like a mountain, forming a path. A few large unmanned engineering mechas continued cleaning up the ruins along with loud booming sounds. A few light mechas walked out from the snowy fog. They could be seen through the protective shield that they were the administrative officials of the planet, not the soldiers. "Hello, I'm the mayor of Foggy Mountain, Ellen." Mayor Ellen didn't have any experience in operating the mechas. She parked the mecha in front of Xingju clumsily and told him about the current situation, saying, "The crack in the space has been blocked for the time being. I don't know what has happened, and there is a strange hole on the other side. We don't dare go in there for the time being." The crack in the space was in the deep part of the ruins of the factory. After 3 days and 3 nights of cleaning by the unmanned engineering mechas, a large area and a few simple roads had been cleared. The long whiskers of the dead cockroaches could be seen fluttering slightly on the muddy roads once in a while, and some black dots could be seen crawling past the ruins on both sides. The administrative authorities had deployed a great number of cockroaches around the crack in the space. Dozens of military mechas and the martial practitioners in light armor were scattered around the crack, looking at Xingju and his group curiously. They didn't know who the military commander was or which fleet he belonged to. All they knew was that the commander had a very high authority. Xingju walked to the front of the crack in the space. Looking at the frosted glass barrier in silence, he suddenly reached out his hand and touched it. Seeing this scene, Mayor Ellen, the local officials and the people on the Scorching Sun battleship were all startled. The frosted glass looked solid, but it was the rumored sea of dark matter on the other side. What if something went wrong? What they didn't know was that Xingju's purpose of sensing the energy inside the barrier with his finger was to confirm his knowledge. He was certain after his fingertip touched the barrier. The Snow Girl was too powerful. Jingjiu and the joyous monk had to pay a great price and take a great risk to seal the crack in the space temporarily, but it seemed to be as easy as eating a meal for the snow girl. Though she merely sealed the crack in the space temporarily, it was still a miracle. "Where is the strange hole you mentioned?" asked Jingjiu as he pulled back his finger. A few officials led him to a spot on the ground behind the crack in the space, saying, "The detector can't determine the depth of the hole. It seems to be made of some kind of absorbent material, so we can't ascertain what's inside." The entrance to the hole looked ordinary, but it was very dark, looking like an abandoned motorized well. Xingju walked to the front of the hole and took a few glances at it. "Level 5, clear the area," he said. Jiang Zhixing and the other officers and soldiers of the Scorching Sun battleship came forward and asked all the local officials and martial practitioners to leave the place politely but forcefully. Soon after, they maneuvered the mechas to fly away from the place and set up a no-entry zone with a diameter of 10 kilometers. In the meantime, they adjusted the scanning range of the satellites outside the atmosphere. Xingju reached out his finger and wrote a few amulets at the entrance of the hole. Then, he clenched his fingers and crushed the amulets into pieces. The amulet light suddenly dispersed and turned into innumerable lines, flowing into the hole like running water. Then, he grabbed those lines of light and lifted Happy Monk up from the bottom of the hole, which was more than 10 kilometers deep. Happy Monk's clothes were torn, and his golden body was covered with wounds. His eyes were closed, and he was still in a coma. Xingju cleared the area not because he was worried that Happy Monk would be watched, but because he didn't want others to see him in such a sorry state. The lines of light suddenly dispersed and turned into light spots, falling on Happy Monk's golden body like leaves in the spring rain, and slowly seeping into it. It didn't take long for Happy Monk to wake up. Seeing Xingju in front of him, he knew that 6 days had passed. Presumably, the snow girl had already gone far away. Looking at the misty glaze on the crack in the space, he murmured, "It's said that one will go blind after seeing too much snow. Is it true that his eyes look like this?" That day, Happy Monk fled to the dark sea and went straight to hell. Xingju, the sword fairy Ensheng, and many others thought that they would never see him again in this lifetime. Xingju felt very gratified to see him again today. Noticing that Happy Monk's mood was a bit off, Xingju raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "That's a cataract eye." Emotions were like the ocean. Once one was immersed in it, it was hard to extricate himself from it, even though Happy Monk was the forefather of the Zen sects and had an unparalleled willpower. To get rid of this kind of emotion, one had to do it in the opposite way. The Zen sects had a similar saying. Happy Monk sighed, "That's not the way to use the dry shit puppet." Xingju didn't say anything more. He took off the military coat and put it on Happy Monk. Xingju ordered Jiang Zhixing to send a mecha to take Happy Monk back to the spaceship to recuperate. He also brought a few sets of melting equipment from the spaceship. Before Happy Monk left, he glanced at Jingjiu and said, "You're not as good as me and Chao Yuan in this aspect. Don't force yourself." Xingju said, "It's fine as long as you can do it. You don't have to be very good at it." The high temperature generated by the melting equipment melted all the snow in the ruins of the factory. All of a sudden, water of various sizes was falling down everywhere. Some cockroaches that didn't leave the factory were burned to death by the high temperature and washed out by the hot water. It was thought that they wouldn't be resurrected again. Mayor Ellen and other officials, as well as those martial arts cultivators wearing light mechas, stood in the distance outside the ruins, looking at the bright light that shot into the sky and the heat that seemed to be right in front of them. They were very shocked and did not know what the military was doing. The unimaginably high temperature even reached the upper atmosphere. All of a sudden, the snowflakes fell down and turned into rain before they reached the ground. In the rainstorm, a few military mechas landed in front of Mayor Ellen and the others. Seeing the order on the light screen and the name of the person, Mayor Ellen felt even more shocked and baffled, wondering why Eve was arrested. Chapter 962. 2 days later. The joyous monk opened his eyes in the medical cabin and waved his hand to drive away the blue electric arcs surrounding his body. He sat up slowly in the pale green liquid and said while looking at another medical cabin, "I didn't expect it to be so soon. The snow girl has made a very good barrier. The difference between the inside and outside is small, so it's easier to melt it." Along with the sound of splashing water, Tsing-ju sat up in the medical cabin and turned off the liquid nitrogen with his awareness. He got up and put on his military uniform before he walked to the window and looked outside. The joyous monk got up and went to the bathing equipment by the wall and took a hot bath. He should bathe in the high-temperature flame to feel a little pleasure, like how Jing-ju liked bathing in the lava. Yet, bathing in the water was the only way to satisfy the spiritual needs, even for the immortals or the Buddhas. The water droplets slid down from his thin and weak golden body full of scars and disappeared instantly. He took out a monk robe from the Grand Nirvana and put it on before he walked to the window. Outside the window was the fields on the outskirts of Foggy City, covered by a vast expanse of white snow. He could vaguely see the black specks of the engineering meccas in the distance. "I don't understand what your majesty means," the joyous monk said expressionlessly. "When I saw her living in the residential building that day, I was in deep thought. Later on the basketball court, I thought she intended to subdue Jingjiu, but it looks like I'm wrong." Tsing-ju had seen the basketball court on the light screen, but he didn't see the following scenes. "Did she subdue Jingjiu?" he asked. "I saw with my own eyes that she had successfully grasped the all-in-one sword and used the sword formation of Aoyama to kill those agents of darkness. It's simple, it's just a scratch." Looking at the residential buildings in the distance, the joyous monk gave another conclusion. "Shin Aoyama has lost." By now Tsing-ju knew how the 9 black suns had fallen. He fell silent for a long time. The joyous monk said, "I don't understand. Now that she has subdued the all-in-one sword, what is she doing here? Yet, she didn't go to the Sea of Dark Matter." Tsing-ju said, "As I said the other day, the snow girl might not go to the Sea of Dark Matter." "I want to know what she experienced here," said Happy Monk with a blank expression. "The relevant data has been sorted out. They stayed on this planet for a year and a half, and most of the time, they lived in the residential building you are looking at. They never interacted with anyone except for a female official. The City Hall of Fogshan City was unprecedentedly quiet. There were no primary school students coming to visit, nor were there any city councilors who kept arguing. There were only policemen in light full isolation armor guarding several gates, vigilantly watching the outside. The temperature on the surface of the planet was still very low, and the cleanup and inspection was not over yet. Most of the humans would still have to live underground for a long time, but the images on the surface would be broadcasted to them in real time, so they should feel much more relaxed. No one was working or living here. The new heating system had just been activated, and most of the windows and ventilation ducts were broken. The chill outside the city hall seeped into the hall and gradually occupied every room. Perhaps it was because of the cold or the shock. Eve's face was pale, and her hands holding the hot tea were trembling slightly. The sound of footsteps could be heard outside the door, and then the door was pushed open. A soldier in the same light armor came in and placed a pot of hot water and some pastries on the table, asking her politely if she needed anything else. Eve forced herself to calm down, shook her head, and thanked him. The soldier left. Looking at the frozen pastries on the plate, she thought of the pastries she had given to that youth every once in a while in the past year. The monsters of the Sea of Dark Matter were all dead, and the alarm was lifted. The people in the underground were waiting happily and peacefully for the day when they could return to the surface of the earth. Yet, she was brought back to the surface of the earth and locked up in this room before she could join the celebration. What exactly was going on? Did it have something to do with Len? In another room on the other side of the wall, Tsing-Ju pulled back his gaze from the wall and said, "She is a regular person." To put it more precisely, Eve could cultivate, but her cultivation state was relatively low, the sixth level of the fire-observing state, similar to Zhong Lizi at the Shurshine Institute. However, the moon-gazing planet was a remote and poor place. Her low cultivation state was enough for her to work in the government department. As far as the joyous monk and the ascendants like Tsing-Ju were concerned, she was an extremely ordinary person. Of course, it doesn't matter what kind of person she is, what matters is what she knows. Unfortunately, according to the records of the interrogation 2 days ago, she doesn't know anything. Tsing-Ju put down the hot tea in the cup and said, "I know you are interested in her, but it's meaningless. I'll have someone send her back later." The Snow Girl and Jingjiu had lived on this planet for more than a year. All the ascendants wanted to know the details of their lives during this period. In addition to the residential building, the people who had participated in their lives were also important sources of information. "I'll ask her in person," said the joyous monk. Tsing-Ju knew what he meant by asking her in person. "She is a regular person, what if she can't bear it?" he asked with a slightly changed expression. "She won't." The joyous monk came to the next room before Tsing-Ju could respond. Eve was in a daze while holding the cup of hot tea in her hands. She was startled when she suddenly found someone in front of her, spilling some hot tea out. The joyous monk didn't ask any questions. "Look into my eyes," he said directly. Eve felt that the voice of this young monk seemed to have some kind of magic power. She couldn't help but look into his eyes, and then she was immersed in them. The eyes of the joyous monk were calm and deep, like the well water illuminated by the sunlight. There were 2 cultivation sects in Chaotian that were best at the mind-reading method. They were the heaven-human connection of Shui-Yu Nunnery and the two-mind connection of Guoqing Temple. Taipingzhenren had been the chief monk of Guoqing Temple and could control the minds of the people in the world by the mind-reading method. The Guoqing Temple was founded by the joyous monk himself, so one could imagine how powerful his ability in this aspect was. Eye contact was not a necessary part of the two-mind connection, but it was a habit of his. It didn't take long for the joyous monk to end the two-mind connection. Looking at Eve, who was still in a state of confusion, he said with a bit of surprise and self-mockery, "I didn't expect you to be a good person like me." Did he mean a person who behaved according to the social norms or a person with a clean soul? He saw many scenes in Eve's consciousness. He saw the residential building with the lights on, the birch tree illuminated by the lights, the hobby class in the administrative center, Jingju learning the zither, the little girl named Hua Shi holding the snow girl and watching a childish cartoon in the waiting room, and they walked into the subway. The scenes were not continuous, but the information was enough to draw some conclusions. The snow girl might want to subdue the unparalleled sword Jingjiu, or she might have some ideas about the little girl named Hua Shi, but she was really hiding herself. Not hiding the world, but hiding herself. She didn't want to get in touch with the world because she was afraid. The Emperor was actually afraid of that computer. This fact had a great mental impact on the joyous monk. For a moment, he was as bewildered as Eve on the other side of the table. The door of the room was pushed open and Tsing-Ju walked in. He felt relieved after making sure that Eve's spirit was merely shaken and not damaged. Looking at the joyous monk, he found that his spiritual world was also in a state of turmoil. He couldn't help but feel worried. For many understandable reasons, the human cultivation practitioners in Chaotian feared the snow girl the most, but none of them would hate her. In the most secret part of their spiritual world, they even worshipped the snow girl. However, the joyous monk's fanaticism toward the snow girl was obviously a bit excessive. The joyous monk calmed down a bit. He walked to the window and looked at the vast white ground, remaining silent. Tsing-Ju's saint heart suddenly felt uneasy, feeling that something was happening. Looking at the back of the joyous monk, he said, "Release her spiritual soul, otherwise there will be some sequelae." The joyous monk still didn't speak, nor did he turn around. Silent, he still looked at the snowy scene outside the window. If Eve remained in this state for a while, her spirit would be damaged, and she might become an idiot after waking up. It was very quiet in the room, and the atmosphere grew tense. Eve didn't notice it at all. She looked at the tea spilled on the table, and her thoughts were somewhere else. It was then that a drop of tea drifted up from the table soundlessly and landed squarely between her eyebrows. The expression in her eyes grew clearer, but she hadn't woken up yet. Perhaps the drop of tea was worried that her sudden awakening would alarm something, so it moved soundlessly and formed a line of words on the table. "Don't make a sound. Don't move. Don't be afraid. I'll protect you." Tsing-ju was in the room at the moment. The person who used the tea to write the words couldn't be him, but who could it be? Looking at the snow outside the window, the joyous monk suddenly laughed out. For some reason, the sudden smile on his handsome face looked rather eerie. "I'm drifting at the bottom of the ocean in the darkness without an exit. Why did I see that bright light? Why are there 9 black suns in this world? I was summoned by the Emperor and saved by her. Where are those monsters? They came to kill her because they are afraid of her. Why would the unconscious beings feel afraid? It's because the sea of dark matter sensed the danger of being destroyed. Yes, I'm not wrong. Since the Emperor doesn't want to go there for the time being, I'll go there." These words were not poems, but more like the ravings of a madman. The last word, "I'll go," was not a dirty word. It was his intention to enter the sea of dark matter again to find a way to subdue those monsters and find the answer to this ultimate problem. Tsing-ju understood what he meant and said with a grave expression, "It's meaningless. Even if your speculation is correct and those monsters are afraid of the Snow Girl, and the Snow Girl might become their king, she has no way to prevent the dark energy from spreading in this universe. As I said on the Scorching Sun battleship the other day, the Emperor might find a way. If she can't find it, the wheat fields are meaningless. Why don't we just burn them down?" The joyous monk said expressionlessly, "They exist in the smoke like the green smoke." The Grand Masters of Oyama wanted to lead the humans to defeat the sea of dark matter. Jing-Jio's basic idea was to lead the humans to a farther place. On the other hand, the joyous monk was thinking of how to help the humans survive in the sea of dark matter. As Tsing-Ju said, they couldn't find a way to prevent the dark energy from spreading. However, he didn't make it clear in the conversation with Zhao Liu on the main planet, the conversation with Chao Yuan, and the conversation with Tsing-Ju on the Scorching Sun battleship. Even if the Snow Girl became the king of those monsters and was willing to accept the surrender of the humans, she still couldn't prevent the dark energy from spreading in this universe. How would she settle the humans then? What's wrong with the humans living in the form of souls? The calm voice of the joyous monk echoed in the room, passing through the broken glass and reaching the distance outside the city hall, as if it would be heard throughout the universe. Chapter 963. This was the fate he had chosen for the humans. All the humans had chosen to die and become souls by a secret method, and then enter the 3,000 worlds of the Grand Nirvana. Both the dark spores and the dark energy would infect the living beings and turn them into monsters whose life and death were unknown. If the living beings like the humans gave up their bodies and became shapeless and immaterial, how could they be infected? As long as the Grand Nirvana wasn't attacked, it would be fine. As such, the Snow Girl had to become the king of the Sea of Dark Matter. By then, the Grand Nirvana would be his gift to her for her ascension to the throne, and it would also be the heaviest burden. Tsing-Ju said while staring into his eyes, "It's because it's impossible." The joyous monk said, "Both you and Zhao Liu knew that I was going to use this method, but you didn't even mention it because you were afraid of being persuaded by me. We've discussed this issue before, so I don't want to waste my time on it, said Xingju sharply. Transforming the humans into souls and getting rid of the restraints of the physical bodies, cutting off the possibility of being infected, and solving the problem of the sea of dark matter was a logical solution. Even if the scientists in the Federation of the Milky Way hadn't thought of it, how could the preachers and the ascendants from Chaotian not have thought of it? In fact, someone had proposed this idea many years ago, and some people had even experimented with it. However, the realm of souls was too far away from reality and couldn't be touched. The experiments didn't make any progress other than making some innocent people suffer extreme pain in the spiritual world. The cultivation practitioners couldn't do it either. Regardless of whether they were the sword ghosts, the Yuanying or the ghosts, they couldn't last too long after leaving their bodies. As such, Taiping Zhenren used the Thunder Soul Wood to transfer his spiritual soul to the underworld disciple named Yin San, so that he could leave the sword jail, but he didn't dare leave on his own. The great Grand Master of the Bloody Demon sect, Qi Song, had been researching this in secret. He didn't give up until he was discovered by Xingju 30 years ago, but in fact, he was still working on it in secret. The reason he was killed by Chao Yuan and Jingjiu was that the Grand Master of Aoyama thought he had gone too far. The joyous monk said, "I'm not an idiot like Qi Song. If I didn't see a new possibility, I wouldn't have come up with this idea." "Where is the possibility you mentioned?" asked Xingju. "In the book written by Jingjiu. If he didn't lie, then Nanchu's sword ghost had existed by itself before his death, and he had existed in the form of sword ghost for a long time before he was reborn by the all-in-one turn. This means that his soul can exist by itself." The joyous monk said calmly while looking at him, "When Jian Shilai used the death shadow to wound Li Chunyang severely in the galaxy beyond the fog, I also saw the existence of his soul. It was the soul left by the Dark Phoenix in his body. Though the Dark Phoenix didn't realize it, it still existed." Xingju said with a cold expression in his eyes, "Jingyang and Nanchu are not ordinary people." "What about the green sky mirror?" asked the joyous monk while looking at him. Xingju asked, "What about the green sky mirror?" The joyful monk said, "As the mirror spirit has become a living being, those people in the green sky mirror have also become real beings. Where did their souls come from?" Xingju said, "The green sky mirror is a world of its own, so it comes from the spiritual energy of heaven and earth." The joyful monk said, "But the green sky mirror has experienced a change. Do you still remember the ghost shadow under the wudong tree?" The expression on Xingju's face changed slightly. "How is it?" The joyful monk said, "Isn't it the soul of the Emperor Zhao?" Xingju suddenly laughed out and said while shaking his head, "Literature. It's just a literary description. Don't laugh. You look guilty when you laugh." The joyful monk said calmly, "I've discovered a new situation and a new possibility. As such, why don't I give it a try? It's more reliable than your plan to ignite the permanent star." Xingju stopped laughing and said to him seriously, "If it's feasible, you will kill all the humans and extract their souls to put in the grand nirvana. Taiping only wanted to kill all the mortals. But you have gone too far." The joyful monk opened his arms, resembling the shadow of the huge bird, as he said, "Now that the souls still exist, how can we kill them? Even if your judgment of Jingyang and Nanchu is correct, it's impossible for all the humans to cultivate to that level." Xingju continued tersely, "In the end, you have no choice but to use the heaven-human connection to seize the souls by force and then use the deviant magic to refine and solidify them. As long as the wills of those souls are unstable or hidden, they will become dead souls." The joyful monk said, "I will of course find some clean souls to experiment with first." Xingju shook his head and said, "Who would volunteer to let you experiment with their souls?" The joyful monk said, "I have countless believers, and they are all willing to sacrifice their souls to me. Moreover, this kind of thing doesn't have to be voluntary." He looked at Eve behind the table with an appreciative expression in his eyes, saying, "Her soul is very clean, and her will is very firm." No sooner had he said this than one of the prayer beads in his left hand moved, which meant that the time in this world had moved forward for a moment. The wind and snow outside the window seemed to have stopped, no longer whistling, but the sound of wind could be heard in the room. The sound of wind came from Eve's body. A faint light figure was leaving her slowly. The expression in Eve's eyes was still blank. It was unclear what was on her mind, but she suddenly displayed a painful expression. The joyful monk vaguely felt that something was not right, but he didn't stop. He continued to employ the heaven-human connection in an attempt to pull her spiritual soul out. Tsing-ju wouldn't allow such an evil thing to happen in front of him. He pointed his finger at the back of the joyful monk's head. The joyful monk didn't evade, but turned around and looked at Tsing-ju calmly. A golden lotus flower suddenly appeared under Tsing-ju's feet, exuding an extremely high-temperature Buddha fire and enshrouding him instantly. The reason the joyful monk stood by the window for a long time was not because he felt sorry for the departure of the snow girl, but because of the lotus flower under his feet. Tsing-ju saw the darkness in the deepest part of the joyful monk's eyes through the lotus fire and said sadly, "You are indeed crazy." The joyful monk had drifted in the sea of dark matter for a long time and was dragged into the illusionary realm by the two dark figures. Though his golden body wasn't affected, his awareness was affected, and the dark side of his spiritual world was magnified. His Zen heart produced a black lotus, and he entered the demonic path. There is no heavenly demon of the outside world, it's all in the heart. The joyful monk chanted softly. His palm passed through the lotus fire and brought out countless tiny fire dragons, slapping toward Tsing-ju's face in an attempt to take his life. Pop, 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 pop. Countless cracking sounds broke out at the same time. There were more than 300 rooms in the city hall, with more than 700 windows. These windows had been frozen in the severe cold a few days ago. At this time, they were all broken into pieces and sprayed out of the building, forming beautiful white flowers. The white flowers formed by the broken glass windows only lasted for a brief moment, resembling the epiphyllum or the lotus flower in front of the window. Two straight air currents shot up into the sky from the city hall and arrived at the highest point of the atmosphere. The air here was very thin, but Tsing-ju's clothes were still ablaze with flames, illuminating his pale face. The joyful monk said calmly while looking at him, "Between life and death, you still have to think of not destroying the buildings and let the people inside live. You can't walk to the end of the path on Tao. Master, I left you Matsai back then because I thought you people were too pedantic." Tsing-ju didn't say anything. He turned into a residual shadow and appeared in front of the joyful monk. He pointed his finger like a sword and attacked with the righteous energy. A scratch appeared on the joyful monk's golden body, and the golden glow grew brighter. Far behind him, a snow-capped peak hundreds of kilometers away suddenly collapsed. He was indeed the sage of Yamatsai. His seemingly light finger had the power to destroy mountains and split the sky. Dozens of lasers suddenly shot out from the ground, the light battleships outside the atmosphere, and the military transfer spacecraft, surrounding the joyful monk. In the buzzing sound, the joyful monk's clothes were tattered, and his golden body suddenly shone, covering the sun in the sky. In the light ball woven by lasers, the thin and weak figure was faintly discernible. He put one hand together in front of his chest. The Buddha's light illuminated the sky and the collapsed snow-capped peak in the distance. Countless rays of light shot randomly in the atmosphere. A light battleship fell to the ground, emitting black smoke. Several mecha were shot into pieces by the light, and no one knew how many people died. The joyful monk looked indifferently at Tsing-ju, who was dozens of kilometers away. He took out an ancient bell and gently knocked it. The bell sounded distant. Tsing-ju's face became paler. His thin lips opened slightly and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The mouthful of blood quickly condensed in the cold air and turned into something like blood coral, with a faint golden glow on the edge. He waved his sleeves. The blood coral flew forward at an unimaginable speed. Along with the friction with the air, it became smoother and sharper, gradually turning into a flying sword. The saint's blood was the sword. Happy Monk's expression turned solemn. He flipped his right hand and held the great nirvana, blocking in front of him. With a light paw sound, the saint's sword landed on the great nirvana and began to violently tremble, emitting a solemn buzzing sound as if there were countless scholars reading. Happy Monk's eyes were calm. His lips did not move, but the sound of chanting could be heard. After an unknown period of time, the sage sword gradually shattered, turning into countless blood-colored glazes that fell to the ground. The grand nirvana was indeed the most precious treasure in the cultivation world of Chaotian, the spiritual soul of the Zen sections. The happy monk took back the grand nirvana and said to Tsing-ju in the distance, "Teacher, as I said on the scorching sun battleship, you are no match for me." Tsing-ju remained calm and did not speak. He took out a brush and an inkstone out of nowhere and began to write in the ink. There was no real ink in the inkstone, only sunlight that was dyed black by the color of the inkstone. That brush was obviously not an ordinary object. It was something on a different level from the talismans he usually wrote casually. It was true that the words written by the saints were not talismans. They were scriptures. Unexpectedly, the happy monk didn't pick up the great nirvana, nor did he use his golden body to close the distance and attack. Instead, he stayed in his original position and took out a brush and a stack of paper to write. He didn't have an inkstone, but he had paper. He was not a saint, but he was a Buddha. The words written by the Buddha were also scriptures. Tsing-ju dipped the tip of the brush into the sunlight in the inkstone and wrote a word with the blue sky as the paper. The sunlight at the tip of the brush dispersed, and the hairs on the tip of the brush broke. The word drifted away, looking as light as a kite, but as heavy as a mountain. Fix. The happy monk picked up a small brush and wrote a word on the paper calmly and earnestly. Though there was no ink on the brush, the writing was so clear where the brush landed. Then, he waved his hand, and the piece of paper drifted away, heading toward the word fix. The word he wrote was chun. One was a word without paper. The other was a word without ink. Both were Yamatsai's talisman Taoism, but they were written in different scriptures. The two words met at the edge of the atmosphere and suddenly shone brightly, rolling up countless huge winds and blowing away the clouds in the distance. There was a crashing sound, as if the paper was torn. The paper on which the happy monk wrote was not torn, but the word fix written by Tsing-ju was torn. An ethereal and indescribable word covered the sky of Fogshan City. All the meanings gathered in one point, as if it was pressed down, falling on Tsing-ju. It was like a bolt of lightning striking down. Tsing-ju was directly cut down from the sky and fell to the ground, smashing a cliff. The happy monk flew over the cliff and found that it was the half of the mountain that he had smashed that night. He seemed to feel something and said, "The mountain falls and becomes a grave." Tsing-ju stood up from among the rocks and looked at the young monk in the sky, feeling sentimental. "If it were an ordinary play, I would shout 'Wicked disciple,'" he said. "But I can't do it because I haven't taught you much. As for you always saying that you are a farmer, what you really want to be is a general." What he said sounded nonchalant and without a hint of mockery, but a hint of anger showed on the handsome face of the happy monk. "We both use the pens we used to copy the books in Yamatsai, but my paper is made of the peach tree bark in front of the Shuei-yu nunnery's gate. How can you be my match when you have no paper? Unless you use the Guard City pen. Moreover, I traveled all over Chaotian, took you as my master, obtained the sword script of Aoyama as a guide, and visited many sects on the cold mountain. I know everything you know, but you don't. Moreover, I have many precious treasures and 3,000 worlds of the grand nirvana." He looked at Tsing-ju in silence and asked, "Master, how can you be my match?" Sing Ju wiped off the blood stains on the corners of his mouth, and straightened his clothes, saying calmly, "If you can't defeat me, you shouldn't have left the snowland back then." The happy monk asked expressionlessly, "Did you say anything when the immortal Qi song tempered the living soul?" Sing Ju said, "I didn't know it at the time, but I regret it now. So I have to stop you." "Really? But I do like the clean soul of that little girl. Maybe I should tempt it in front of you?" The happy monk still didn't show any expression on his face, and his tone didn't sound evil, but the whole heaven and earth were filled with a terrifying intent. He reached his right hand toward Foggy City dozens of kilometers away and aimed at the dilapidated city hall, intending to grab Eve's soul. Could Sing Ju stop him? In the next moment, the happy monk suddenly felt something was wrong. It was because the soul should be shapeless and incorporeal, and it couldn't feel any weight. But why was the object he grabbed so heavy, like a stone? He turned around and looked over there, only to find that it was not the woman's clean soul that broke through the air from the city hall, but a very blurry mosaic that gave people a dusty feeling. The mosaic stopped in the sky a few kilometers away and gradually revealed its true appearance. It turned out to be a middle-aged man in a gray checkered shirt, with a slightly dark complexion and a calm expression on his face. In the distance, several combat armors landed at the city hall, and Eve should have been rescued. The happy monk slightly raised his eyebrows. Without saying anything, he directly punched. Countless golden flames emerged from his fist and suddenly turned into a fire dragon, traversing a distance of several kilometers and arriving in front of the middle-aged man. Back then, in the space rift of Sunfire Industrial Base, this Buddha fire dragon fist directly repelled a virgin one. Although there was no high-temperature magma on the planet now, and the power of this punch was much weaker, it was still extremely powerful. Even a real immortal standard magic weapon would be smashed by this punch. The middle-aged man's expression did not change. He was still so calm and even a little stiff, but his movements were extremely fast. With a flip of his palm, a circular light mirror appeared in his hand. There were countless runes on the light mirror, moving quickly on their respective circular track. Looking at this scene, the happy monk was a little surprised and let out a soft sigh. At the same time, the dragon formed by the Buddha fire slammed into the light mirror without any fancy moves, and an unimaginable shock wave spread in all directions. With a loud bang, the snow on the surface of the ground jumped up like boiling milk. The golden dragon gradually dissipated in the sky. The light mirror also disappeared without a trace. The happy monk looked at the middle-aged man in silence, and suddenly stretched out his right hand. The middle-aged man also stretched out his right hand. Two huge golden palm prints appeared in the atmosphere, spanning between heaven and earth, and met. An even more unimaginable loud noise appeared on the surface of the planet. The wind howled, and several residential buildings in the distance collapsed. Spaceships flew away to avoid it. Zen Light Mirror, Mahamudra. Which junior in the temple are you? Zen Master? The happy monk looked at the middle-aged man and asked indifferently. The middle-aged man did not answer, but took out an inkstone and a pen. The inkstone was not ordinary, and the pen did not look ordinary either. He dipped the pen in the inkstone and began to write in the air. The happy monk understood the other party's meaning and was slightly angry. Without saying anything, he took out a pen and paper and wrote the word anger. The paper with the word anger floated away and soon arrived not far from the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man had not finished writing. But he did not need to finish writing. Several rainbows rose from the tip of the brush, easily shredding the paper, and then fell on the body of Happy Monk. A golden straight line went dozens of kilometers away, carving a deep ditch in the snow. The Happy Monk stood up from the bottom of the ditch, his monk robe torn, and a clear brush mark appeared on his chest. He raised his head, looked at the middle-aged man in the sky, and asked, "What is this writing? Who are you?" The pen is the guard city brush, and the inkstone is the dragon tail inkstone. The middle-aged man said, I am Lu Shui. Chapter 964. Yes, the immortal pen was the city-guarding pen, one of the 4 treasures of Yamatsai's temple. The extraordinary inkstone was the dragon-tail inkstone, one of the 4 treasures of Yamatsai's temple. The ordinary-looking middle-aged man was the latest sage of Yamatsai, Lu Shui. He was also a person with natural Taoist quality, a former genius disciple of Aoyama sect's Liangwang Peak, the secretary of Shiwang Sun, a high-level official of Bulo Lin, a layman elder of Guoqing Temple, and the only successor of the bloody demon cult. Of course, he also had the most important identity, which was Jing Jiu's servant. So, you are Lu Shui, the scholar with many treasures. Happy Monk brushed off the dirt on his body and said expressionlessly, Now that I see you, you really have a lot of treasures. Lu Shui had so many identities, but he had to call him the scholar with many treasures, indicating that he was really embarrassed at this time. The scholar with many treasures sounded a little low-class and even made people think of him as a pervert. Lu Shui was still as calm and honest as he was hundreds of years ago. He was not provoked by words and said, Yes, I am Lu Shui. I have also been to many places. I know all the magic you know, but you don't. Besides, you don't have as many magic weapons as I do. His tone was very plain and straightforward, without any sense of showing off, but it formed a stronger effect of mockery. Happy Monk was silent for a while and flicked out a prayer bead with his finger. The prayer bead came to the edge of the atmosphere and suddenly broke into pieces, emitting countless clear lights that flowed down like a waterfall and covered the entire foggy mountain city. If seen from a distance, one could probably imagine the scene of an ancient clock falling to the ground. The prayer bead must be a very high-level magic weapon of Zen. Lu Shui was still silent. He took out a small black flag and waved it toward the sky. The small black flag emitted endless coldness and faint ghost weeping. It was actually a ghost streamer. The ghost weeping and the Buddhist chanting in the clear light collided and disappeared. The banner full of turbid air broke through the wind, and was about to roll Happy Monk in. The sinister aura of the ghost banner was extremely strong. It was unknown how many spirits had been sacrificed and trapped within it. Happy Monk moved his fingertips slightly and crushed a prayer bead. It turned into a Vajra pestle and blocked the ghost streamer. There was another loud bang, and he was pushed back into the rubble on the ground. His face was pale, and his eyes were even colder. The 10,000 soul banner of the Blood Demon Church. He looked at Lu Shui, who was flying toward him on a lotus cloud, and said, I don't care if you are a junior in the temple, a scholar in the study, or a disciple of Jingyang. You dare to capture living souls and refine them, which is more evil than what I am about to do. How can you have the face to stand on the right path? Lu Shui said, I didn't use any living souls to refine this streamer. I only soaked it in the underworld river for 300 years. His voice was still steady, and there was no emotion in his tone, but it still made people feel that it was a kind of mockery. It was unknown how many soul fires remained in the underworld river. They didn't have intelligence, and they were not living beings. Even if they were just fragments, they were enough to make this 10,000 soul streamer possess a great power. More terrifyingly, the foundation of this Tao streamer seemed to be a magic treasure of a higher state. In other words, even the 10,000 soul streamer of the immortal Qi song back then was not as powerful as this streamer. The 10,000 soul streamer was like a curtain rolling up the sky, blocking the sun and covering the sky. It wrapped around the Vajra pestle, and faint rust marks appeared on the surface of the pestle in a moment. Even the lower part of the pestle, which was based on the black jade, had some blood-like marks on it. It seemed that the nature of the pestle was about to be stained and its treasure spirit destroyed. Happy Monk withdrew the Vajra pestle and finally took out his most powerful magic treasure, the Grand Nirvana. The Grand Nirvana emitted countless calm and solemn Buddhist lights, wiping out all the black smoke that came with the streamer. Unexpectedly, Lu Shui didn't care about the loss of the dark energy of the 10,000-soul streamer. He kept waving it forward and smashed it down. Did he intend to use the 10,000-soul streamer to perform the sword work of Aoyama, or the ghost sword work of Nan Chu's branch? Happy Monk thought of this, but he wasn't afraid at all. He wielded the Grand Nirvana to counter the attack. The black smoke had dissipated, and the black streamer couldn't advance any further. The seemingly ordinary metal plate contained 3,000 worlds and 6 reincarnations. It was impossible for it to be controlled by the 10,000-soul streamer. Yet, in the next moment, a fourth loud boom broke out in the sky above Foggy City. The sound was very loud, but it was not straightforward. It sounded more like a bell than a thunder, and it was a broken bell. Some of the abandoned farms and transportation facilities nearby were instantly shaken to the ground. The strong wind was howling, and the accumulated snow was falling down, and the sand and pebbles were rolling everywhere. It's not the sword work of Aoyama. Happy Monk wiped off the golden blood stains on the corners of his mouth with his trembling right hand, his expression a bit perplexed. If Lu Shui had used the sword work of Aoyama to control the 10,000-soul streamer, he wouldn't have cared, because he also knew the sword work of Aoyama. However, it was evident that the power of heaven and earth from the Grand Nirvana was not the case. Looking at the Grand Nirvana, his expression changed slightly. If the all-in-one sword was invincible, then the Grand Nirvana was like the green sky mirror, the most powerful defensive magic treasure in Chaotian. It was then that a small pit appeared on the lower right side of the Grand Nirvana. It was not very obvious, but it was nonetheless a pit. He lifted his head to look at Lu Shui, asking in bewilderment, "What is that?" Lu Shui took back the 10,000-soul streamer and took out a black square jade seal from it, saying, "It's the seal of the King of the Underworld." Looking at the seal of the King of the Underworld in Jingjiu's hand, the Happy Monk didn't know what to say for the moment. He sighed softly in a self-mocking manner. In a normal story, in such a situation, Lu Shui would ask, "How many more treasures do you have?" Then Lu Shui would take out a bell or a ruler. It was pointless to do so. The Happy Monk calmed down after the prayer beads moved slightly between his fingers. "There is a world and all things in the Grand Nirvana. You can't break it," he said. It was true that Lu Shui couldn't break the defense of the Grand Nirvana even though he had the 10,000-soul streamer, the Dragontail Inkstone and the City Guard pen. As for the seal of the King of the Underworld, it had indeed created a small pit in the Grand Nirvana and injured the Happy Monk's golden body, but if he wanted to break the Grand Nirvana, a large corner of the seal of the King of the Underworld would fall off before he could achieve his goal. What would he use then? Would his hot-tempered young sister agree to it? "I have another magic treasure that I want to try." When Lu Shui said this, he didn't sound as calm and composed as before. He sounded a bit unconfident. Happy Monk felt a little strange. In that case, why did you use that magic weapon to make the last blow? But since it was the last strike, it must be the strongest one. He stretched out his right hand and pointed it at the sky. A mirror of light appeared between his fingers, and countless Buddhist mantras flowed and rotated slowly. The Grand Nirvana also rotated slowly. A gentle breeze blew. It seemed to pass through the forest of the Guoqing Temple and the Sea of Pines. After saying this, he put away the 10,000-soul streamer and the seal of the King of the Underworld. He sat cross-legged in the air, closed his eyes, and began to adjust his breath and calm his mind. With such a formation, it could be imagined that the magic treasure that would be used later would have great power. A buzzing sound rang through the outskirts of Foggy City, as if something was vibrating at high speed. The breeze between heaven and earth suddenly disappeared. The remaining snow on the ground became very bright. That was because a flying sword appeared between heaven and earth. The flying sword was very slender and short. It was silver all over, and its surface was extremely smooth and bright. The happy monk's expression froze slightly. Only then did he realize that he was so shocked by the various magic treasures of Lu Shui that he forgot about this sword. When he thought of this, the small silver sword had already arrived in front of him. The clouds in the distance surged and shattered, and the remaining snow on the ground was bright as if it was burning. The flying sword vaguely grew a pair of wings, and with an unimaginably sharp sword will and indescribable spiritual aura, it pierced the surface of the Grand Nirvana, giving people a strong feeling that this sword was actually alive. In the sky full of swords, one could vaguely hear a voice, "I am coming." Many years ago, Lei Patian, the peak master of Bihu, stole the Thundersoul wood and gave it to Taiping Jinren in the sword jail because Taiping Jinren promised to give him 2 swords. Later, Lei Patian went crazy when he was locked up in the sword jail. He only knew to keep shouting at the bottom of the well, "If there is no one, then what about 2? 1 means all things in one. 2 means no 2. This small silver flying sword was the Lone Sword. The Lone Sword was one of the main swords of the 9 peaks of Aoyama. It was the main sword of Liangwang Peak, but it had been taken away from Liangwang Peak by the immortal Jingyang many years ago. It looked ordinary and small, but its state was very high, only inferior to the all-in-one sword, slightly better than the first child sword, and far superior to the other main swords, including the Thoughtless Sword. The Lone Sword had followed the immortal Jingyang for many years, and it had even ascended to the dark universe with him. Then, it was thrown to Lu Shui. For hundreds of years, the Lone Sword had turned into a sword bracelet and stayed obediently on Lu Shui's wrist. It had been soaked in the manure water of vegetables, the water on the edge of the pickle jar, and the stinky ink used for writing, vibrating and buzzing a few times. Except for the time when Zhuoruzhui set up the sword formation of Aoyama at the West Sea, it had never turned into a flying sword to fight. Today, its sword light had illuminated heaven and earth. It was about to start its first fight, and its opponent was a figure like the joyous monk and a magic treasure like the Grand Nirvana. In this aspect, its fate was similar to Lu Ada's. Lu Shui's lack of confidence was actually because he didn't trust the sword. He was worried that the sword would turn around and flee when it saw the Grand Nirvana. After all, Jingjiu had a bad evaluation of the sword a few hundred years ago, and its performance over the last few hundred years wasn't that good either. Time had changed a lot. The young man had grown up, and the sword spirit had gradually developed. The small silver flying sword was even more confident than Lu Shui, stabbing toward the Grand Nirvana without any hesitation. The Grand Nirvana was very strong, but the most powerful barrier was not the sword itself, but the worlds in the small metal squares. Only by passing through those worlds could one reach the true body of the Grand Nirvana. The Lone Sword was the sharpest sword in Chaotian, save for the one in Jingjiu's right hand. But could it pass through the barriers formed by all the objects in the worlds? Along with the bright sword light, the remaining snow on the ground rose up abruptly, and the cliff rocks turned around and pointed at the joyous monk with their sharp sides. The heaven and earth in the suburb of Foggy City were filled with formidable sword wills. The soldiers on the battleships and spaceships who had fled to the distance looked in this direction through the remote monitoring system. Their eyes felt a bit sore when they saw the bright lights. In the next moment, the monitoring equipment was destroyed. The dense and formidable sword wills, and the unusual phenomenon of heaven and earth, were similar to the scene of the fight between Jing Jiu and Jian Shilai in Diyuan City. It was even similar to the scene when the snow girl held Jing Jiu's hand and flew toward the 9 black suns in the sky. "This is the 5th one," Xing Ju said sentimentally, while looking at the Lone Sword stabbing into the Grand Nirvana with his hand on a slowly rotating rock and sensing the sword wills in heaven and earth. The Grand Master of Aoyama, General Li, Jing Jiu, Jian Shilai, and Lu Shui had all reached the last step in the sword work of Aoyama. The all-in-one. The all-in-one was a sword that could break everything in the world. The delicate and sharp tip of the sword had passed through many worlds and seen many skies in a very short time, and had finally landed on the real surface of the Grand Nirvana. Along with a clear sound, the lone sword stabbed into the Grand Nirvana. Though it was not deep enough to be seen by the naked eye, it was nevertheless broken. A tiny crack appeared in the center of Joyous Monk's eyebrows, and a hint of blood could be vaguely seen in the golden glow. The sword light illuminated the remaining snow again. The lone sword flew back to the side of Lu Shui, quivering slightly and looking a bit dimmer. It should be because it was exhausted by the previous blow. Joyous Monk looked at Lu Shui in silence, allowing the drop of blood to flow out from the golden crack. "This is not enough," he said. No sooner had he said this than Lu Shui's body suddenly turned illusionary and drifted to the front of Joyous Monk like a ghost. He held a sword in his right hand and passed through the infinite worlds again, landing on the Grand Nirvana. The spot where the sword landed was precisely the small crack that the lone sword had pierced through. As the two swords joined together, the small crack became deeper. A cracking sound came from the depths of Joyous Monk's golden body. The Grand Nirvana turned back quickly. Joyous Monk fell on the Grand Nirvana, holding the cold metal surface with one hand. It seemed that the lower half of his body could not move. A stream of golden blood oozed out from the back of his frock. That was the position of the vertebrae. For the Ascendants, it was also the key place to transfer fairy energy. If they were seriously injured, they might become paralyzed like ordinary people. Joyous Monk's face was pale. Looking at the sword in Lu Shui's hand, he wanted to ask something, but he spat out a mouthful of blood. The cinnabar-like blood in the painting fell on the rubble, ignited a blazing flame, and then disappeared instantly. What he wanted to ask was, if you used the all-in-one sword to drive the lone sword to break the 3,000 worlds of the Grand Nirvana, what kind of sword was that? That sword looked ordinary, but it was actually as cold as water, and it was extremely delicate, like clear water that could not freeze under certain conditions in extremely cold environments. The first child sword, Lu Shui introduced. Chapter 965. The snowflakes that had risen up along with the sword wills fell down again, as if they were welcoming a new snowfall. The Joyous Monk sat on the Grand Nirvana, letting the snowflakes fall on his tattered monk robe. The scene looked rather miserable, reminiscent of a ruined temple. The first child sword was the sword of the great Grandmaster of the Foggy Island, Nanchu. Later, it was taken by the immortal Daoyuan of Aoyama and given to Jingjiu. After many legendary stories, it returned to Aoyama and was sent to the royal palace of Zhaoga City by Jingjiu. Nobody expected it to appear here. In the ranking of the flying swords in Chaotian, the lone sword and the first child sword were ranked below the all-in-one, both of which were in the hands of Lu Shui. As for the sword style he employed, the first move was the all-in-one. It was unclear what the second move was, but it sounded like the underworld fairy sword, which was obviously not the case. The Grand Nirvana couldn't withstand everything, and a small opening appeared on it. The Joyous Monk's Zen heart was cut off, and his golden body was broken, turning him into a paralyzed man. Yet it didn't mean that everything was over. Looking at Lu Shui in the sky, the Joyous Monk's eyes grew even more indifferent, with a hint of eeriness in them. "I admire the style and methods of the Jingyang branch," he said, "but you people can only protect yourselves at most. You can't solve the problems of others." Besides the others of the Jingyang branch, it was the entire human race. Lu Shui was much more powerful than he had imagined, but it was still not enough. As such, he had to do it himself. The Joyous Monk sat up straight with his hands on the surface of the Grand Nirvana, and used his hands to form a lotus seat with his legs that couldn't move. He couldn't feel his body from the waist down, and he couldn't move either, but he still had his hands. His jade-like palm landed on the surface of the Grand Nirvana. He slapped the table. Boom! Countless blazing golden flames shot out from the edge of the Grand Nirvana, forming a fiery tail. The Grand Nirvana left the ground and flew toward the sky at an unimaginable speed, like a shooting star moving in the opposite direction. In an instant it had arrived at the edge of the atmosphere. Stepping on the lone sword, Lu Shui chased after it with the first child's sword in his hand. All of a sudden, a few metal squares on the surface of the Grand Nirvana were broken, releasing a large amount of black smoke. The black smoke was, of course, not a disguise of the lowest level, but the spores of darkness. The joyful monk had fought against the sea of dark matter for many years, and he had even gone to the bottom of the ocean and done a great deed for the humans. During battle, in order to prevent contamination and quickly stabilize the situation, he would directly suck the blood thumbs and dark spores into an uninhabited world within the Grand Nirvana. As the joyous sect, with the god, the monk, with the number 1, and the master of the monk, he. For the Zen sects of the god, the people of the sect of the Chen with it, the humans, as the monk, the king, Bin Chen spirit of the sect, formed by Kultivoff the Nisht, monk. Countless gusts of wind formed tornadoes that rose from the ground to the sky, sealing the dispersing black smoke within a fixed area. If the black smoke were to reach the surface of the planet, the unprepared officials and soldiers would all be killed, and the infected monsters might threaten the millions of people in the underground who were not aware of the danger. The favorable situation of the moon-gazing planet would be destroyed. Lu Shui was fully aware of this. He turned around and flew back into the atmosphere without hesitation. He waved the 10,000 soul banner to collect the black smoke. The Grand Nirvana sect had already flown past the rocky belt of the waning moon, turning into a small bright spot. A small battleship happened to be nearby, which fired a laser gun at him. The joyous monk tilted his head to avoid the shot. He looked at the black battleship expressionlessly and waved his hands. 2 huge golden hands appeared in the dark space, grabbing the 2 ends of the small battleship and tearing it into 2 pieces. Many people drifted out from the battleship. Some of them had become corpses, and some of them were busy installing the life support system. In the soundless world of darkness, everything seemed to be in a state of panic and cruelty. The joyous monk turned to look at the surface of the planet with a strange darkness in his eyes. He said in a slightly neurotic manner, "Wait for me to take off these clothes, then I'll come back for you." Lu Shui heard this sentence and understood it. He ignored it and continued to concentrate on collecting the dark spores with the 10,000 soul banner. Xingju threw the fan into the sky and sat down against the rocks wearily. He began to broadcast to all his fellow Taoists in the entire galaxy. The great compassion monk's Zen heart was polluted by the extraterrestrial demon, and he went crazy. The 10,000 soul banner returned to the hand. The body of the banner swayed slightly twice and then calmed down. The hand had obviously done a lot of farm work, but for some reason it had been tempered by the immortal qi, so the calluses did not disappear. Lu Shui flew out of the atmosphere and saved all the people who were still alive. Then he flew back to the ground and walked toward the rock. From time to time, cockroaches crawled out of the cracks in the rocks, walking around vigilantly and loyally. Fortunately, all the dark spores and blood thumbs had been taken away or killed, so there was no need for them to sacrifice again for the time being. Xingju's clothes were faintly stained with blood. He could not stand steadily for a long time, but he refused to sit down and stood there waiting for the arrival of Lu Shui. Lu Shui walked up to him and saluted him according to the etiquette of the disciples of Yamatsai. He said, "Greetings to the sage master." Xingju looked at him in silence and suddenly asked, Are you a disciple of Yamatsai or a disciple of Guoqing Temple, or a swordsman of the Aoyama sect? This question obviously had other meanings hidden in it. It was not easy to answer, but it was not a problem for people like Lu Shisui. He asked in puzzlement, I'm both. Xingju thought of the characters in the game, The Path Toward Heaven, and laughed self-mockingly. He did not shy away from letting Lu Shisui support him, and walked out of the rocks. He said, I didn't expect you to also ascend and stay by my side. After a moment of silence, Lu Shisui said, After I came out, I learned that something had happened to young master, so I decided to take a look first. Xingju glanced at him and said, You are different from people like Jingyang and Tong Yen. You don't lie. Lu Shisui smiled embarrassedly and said, Yes, I'm just following you. Xingju asked, Is this the arrangement of Zhao Leu or Tong Yen? Lu Shisui said, No arrangement. We discussed it many years ago. If we find something wrong after ascending, we should be prepared to act. Xingju asked curiously, What kind of preparation? Lu Shisui said honestly, Tong Yen wrote a lot of plans, but Zhao Leu was too lazy to read them. She said that it was enough to keep an eye on the most powerful ones. Xingju asked again, At that time, you were sure that the opponents might be the immortals of the previous generation who had ascended? Lu Shisui said, This situation is more common in stories. Xingju glanced at him and said with a smile, Keep an eye on one person and take action when needed? Lu Shisui was really honest and said, According to ability and threat, I should keep an eye on Merry Monk, but I couldn't find him, so I kept an eye on you. Xingju found that he really couldn't understand these young people. He said with a slightly strange expression, I am your Grandmaster in Yamatsai, and Merry Monk is the Grandmaster of Guoqing Temple. But after you ascended, you kept an eye on us and were ready to kill us at any time? Yes, Lu Shisui replied honestly. Xingju didn't know how to react, whether he should feel angry or amused. Are all the ascendants of the new generation as confident as you? He asked. Lu Shisui said, We are more prepared and have more things with us, especially me. Thinking of the numerous magic treasures Lu Shisui had brought with him during the battle, Xingju said helplessly, You have brought the Dragontail Inkstone and the Guard City pen with you. What about the house? Lu Shisui said, My young master had said that we should cut off the root of the problem and try our best to solve it. There are no more internal conflicts in Chaotian now, only external threat. Regardless of whether the external threats are the heavenly demons of the outside world or something else, we should bring the most powerful magic treasures with us. It was indeed what the immortal Jingyang had thought back then, which was why he brought the all-in-one sword and the lone sword with him, leaving the thoughtless sword to the successor of Shenma Peak, Jinshan. Zhao Leu had used the same reason to persuade Lu Shisui, and then to persuade the current emperor and king of the underworld to lend them their most powerful treasures. These swords and magic treasures of the highest state in Chaotian were all brought by Lu Shisui. He was the god of death prepared by Zhao Leu for the fairy world. Even Tong Yen didn't know about this. Is Tong Yen watching the Grandmasters of Aoyama? Xingju suddenly thought of something. He knew that Zhao Leu was on the main planet at the moment, sitting by the edge of the cliff platform and watching the young woman in a bathing robe by the hot spring every day. That young woman was of course very important to this world. In terms of importance and prowess, the joyous monk should be ranked third. Lu Shisui admitted that he was his original target. What about the most important person, Shin Aoyama? Tong Yen had disappeared without a trace after leaving the ancestral house of the Shin family. Did she go to the ancestral planet? Lu Shisui was certain that he wouldn't lie that day, at least he couldn't deceive these masters and seniors. As such, he pressed his lips together tightly, not saying anything or thinking about it. Seeing his behavior, Xingju couldn't help but laugh out. He now understood why Jingju loved this child so much and why Zhao Leu gave him so many magic treasures. Tsing-ju couldn't help but feel more interested in Lu Shui, asking, I can see through the first of the two swords used to break the great nirvana. What's the second sword? After some thought, Lu Shui realized that it didn't contradict what Tong Yen and Zhao Liu had told him many years ago. 200 years ago, Zhao Liu borrowed a magic treasure from the Dongyi Daoist sect and went to the South Ocean to disperse the fog on the foggy island, he said. We went to the island and found a few sword scripts left by Nanchu. In those scripts were the ghost sword style that he had cultivated in the beginning and the sword ghost Dao that he had comprehended later. But we couldn't use them. In the end, we went to the Snowland and learned something from them. The Snowland. Did you go to find that little snow girl? Tsing-ju's expression changed a bit, wondering if Chao Tian was so beautiful at the moment. The queen doesn't know how to use a sword, so we went to find Pringlang. His talent is. Lu Shui suddenly realized that he hadn't introduced Pringlang's identity yet. He is the sect master of the No Mercy sect, but he doesn't live on Longevity Mountain and seldom leaves the Snowland, he said. Tsing-ju waved his hand before he could finish, saying, I've read the book written by Jingjiu, so I know who he is. Speaking of the book, Lu Shui praised, I played the game first, and then read the book later. I found out that the book written by young master is so interesting. He suddenly asked, Well, do you know why young master wrote that book? In the apartment on the Mingxing Street in the underground of the Stargate, Jingjiu wrote the book, The Path Toward Heaven, and asked the Twirling Rain Company to adapt it into a game. The game had become popular in the Federation of the Milky Way, and the book had more and more readers. However, the book had caused many significant events in the world that the regular people couldn't see. As for why Jingjiu wrote this book, different people had different opinions and explanations. Some people thought that he intended to use the book to find his colleagues of Aoyama who were scattered in various places in the universe for the sake of their safety. Zhao Liu thought that he intended to announce to all the ascendants of the previous generations that he was such a person and that they shouldn't bother him. Tong Yen thought that his true purpose was hidden very well. In fact, he intended to establish an intelligence system and a communication system similar to the one of the curtain rollers through the game. What new opinion did Lu Shui, who had known Jingjiu for the longest time, have? He was worried that the masters of the previous generations would be homesick. That's why he wrote so many scenes and characters, Lu Shui said earnestly. Hearing this answer, Tsing-ju was taken aback at first, and then he laughed out. He couldn't help but reach out his hand to rub Lu Shui's head. According to the time in Chaotian, Lu Shui was a few hundred years old, and he was a weirdo who could beat the grandmaster of the Zen sections. Yet, he still looked like an adorable youth, who couldn't help but rub his head. As they were talking, the two of them had left the rocky cliff and arrived at a basketball court. On their way, Lu Shui had been sending fairy energy into Tsing-ju's body. Tsing-ju's injury had healed a lot. Looking at the residential building in the distance, Tsing-ju said to him, As far as your young master is concerned, this is his hometown. As far as the drunkard uncle in Australia was concerned, Inner Mongolia was his real hometown, though there were many grasslands on both sides. Perhaps it was for this reason that his sock puppet, 6 Businesses of Green State, had the 2 words Green State in it. It was probably the same as I couldn't live without the 2 words Aoyama. It's true that he went back to the Qidien and started a new book, titled The Sun and Moon of the Prosperous Tang Dynasty. It was said that he intended to use the sock puppet to do something new, but he revealed himself on the internet in less than 2 days. Chapter 966. The number 720 was painted on the side wall of the residential building. It was old to begin with, and it had been tortured by the low temperature a few days ago, so the paint had peeled off even more, and it was almost unrecognizable. The special soldiers of the Scorching Sun battleship in their battle armor guarded the surroundings of this regular residential building. A few days ago, the joyous monk was recuperating on the battleship, Tsing Ju was mending the space crack, and Lu Shui was keeping an eye on the two of them. Nobody had come to disturb this place until now. The accumulated snow on the flowerbed was mixed with ash, and so was the ground, so that the ash even covered the broken birch tree. The iron door of the unit made a squeaking sound. Lu Shui and Tsing Ju walked in, and then pushed open the door of the room. The smell of the steamed cakes still lingered in the kitchen, and the smell of the sword fire still lingered in the living room. Crouching in a corner of the sofa, the little cat stared at the newcomers alertly. As he found that it was not one of the family members who had come back, he felt nervous and wanted to jump up and run away. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid," Lu Shui said hastily. He didn't know if it should be described as his charisma, or if it was a talent that was stimulated by spending too much time with the vixen. When the little tabby cat heard his voice, it actually calmed down and lay back on the sofa. It even flipped over cutely and revealed its belly. Lu Shui walked to the front of the sofa and rubbed his belly. Tsing Ju reminded him, "She's pregnant. Be gentle." Lu Shui asked curiously, "Do you have a cat as well?" "I haven't seen one on the battleship." Tsing Ju said, "The base 857 is too boring. What else can I do if I don't have a cat?" The two of them had talked for a long time, and it seemed peaceful, but in fact, the undercurrent didn't subside. It wasn't until they talked about the cat that the atmosphere became more relaxed. Such an atmosphere was suitable for talking about the old days and chatting. Tsing Ju asked, "How is Yamatsai doing? Does Buqiu Xiao have a chance to ascend?" Lu Shui told him briefly about the current situation of Yamatsai and the other sects, since he was familiar with all of them. All in all, it was very peaceful in Chaotian at the moment. The deviant sects had been wiped out a long time ago, or they were imprisoned by Su Zai in the old Kunlun. The cultivation practitioners had nothing else in their minds, they were focused on the path toward heaven. "In the end," he said, "Master has been a saint for many years. The reason why he hasn't ascended is probably because there are some things that he can't let go of for the time being." Tsing Ju thought about the contents of the book and thought, if it was not Hejan or Shuiyu nunnery, who knows? Jingju still thought the Chaotian described by Lu Shui was too perfect, so he asked, "Is there no dispute between the various sects and the imperial court?" "Sects? Oh, you mean the few of us. Kanyang is at the Mirror sect, Sensei is at the Platanus sect, Su Zai is in the northwest, Ada is at the West Ocean most of the time, I'm in Yamatsai, and Peng Lang is in the Snowland. Everybody is fine. Oh well. Tong Yen and Zhuoruzhui don't like each other, but Xiao He said that they are acting for the sake of the world. One is the sect master of Aoyama, and the other is the sect master of Zhongzhou School. It's not right if they don't have some conflict." Lu Shui said after some thought, "I think what Xiao He said is correct. It's useless even if Zhuoruzhui doesn't like Tong Yen. He can't do anything as long as Zhao Liu and Nan Wang don't agree." Having heard this, Tsing Ju fell silent for a long time before saying sentimentally, "The Aoyama sect unifies the world. Even the grandmasters of Aoyama couldn't do it when they were alive. Unexpectedly, Jingyang has done it. I'm not sure if he is truly a saint by doing nothing, or if he has a great foresight." Thinking of Qing Er's opinion of him, Lu Shui said sheepishly, "Young master is very good at playing chess. Those who played chess were all black-hearted. The better they played chess, the more black-hearted they would be." Having said this, Lu Shui found a chessboard on the tea table. Then he found a piano by the window with a closed lid and a book on it. He recalled that he had seen countless monsters rush to the front of this building on the Scorching Sun battleship 10 days ago and heard the music of the piano in the building. He couldn't help but feel frustrated. The little tabby cat suddenly turned over in his hand and passed between Tsing Ju's legs, leaping into the bedroom and hiding under the bed. As the door was opened, 2 elite soldiers walked in with Ms. Eve. They turned around and left after bowing to her. "Please take a seat," said Lu Shui. "You can take off the breathing mask now. It's safe here." Ms. Eve sat on the sofa nervously and took off the breathing mask. She combed her messy hair with her trembling hands, saying nothing. "Don't be nervous. We're just having a chat," said Xingju. Ms. Eve didn't know who he was, but she guessed that he should be an important figure in the military. She didn't know what to say, so she shook her head helplessly and unconsciously. Then she looked at Lu Shui, her eyes brightening. "It was you who woke me up just now? I'm sorry to have brought you these troubles and accidents. What we want to know is about that Leon, which isn't in the file," said Lu Shui. Happy Monk already knew everything she knew through the two-mind connection, and there were many reports in the investigation file. But he wanted to chat with this lady more. It was a completely different way of communication. Yes, it was communication so that he could perceive more details. "I often come to this area but rarely come to this building. Because according to the requirements of the work manual, as long as the autistic teenager shows the willingness to contact society, we shouldn't take the initiative to get close to him. The first time I came, I was to deliver a poster to Leon." Ms. Eve's voice sounded in the room. It gradually stopped trembling and became smoother. It didn't take long for the conversation to end. With the help of the 2 soldiers, she put on the isolation helmet again and left Building 720. She sat in an advanced hover car. The logistics staff in the car handed her a cup of tea at the right temperature. She thanked them and took the cup in her hand, sipping it. Her pale face gradually became ruddy. Looking out the window at the frozen and broken building walls, she felt as if she was still in a dream. Lu Shui walked to the window and looked at the rotten frozen pears. He knew that the temperature in the room had been maintained very well these days. He picked up the book on the piano and flipped through it. He saw the stars in the night sky and a sudden explosion. He saw the tall and thin birch tree and the tall and thin man standing on the flower bed. He also saw the bamboo between plum blossoms splashed by blood on the snow. Then he opened the cover of the piano and clumsily pressed it with his fingers. He turned to look at the sofa. He seemed to see the young master sitting on the sofa, but not as lazy and boneless as he had been hundreds of years ago. He sat very straight, holding a chess piece in his hand and placing it on the chessboard seriously. Then he saw the young master stand up and walk to the window to play the piano. He began to play the picture and began to observe the world outside the window. "Do you think he woke up?" Xingju asked. Lu Shui shook his head and said, "The young master can't be so diligent, and it's even more impossible for him to learn the 4 arts." So of course, Jingzhou hadn't woken up. He was still the teenager named Leon, but he didn't know where the snow girl had taken him. He had an even better reason, but he couldn't tell Xingju. It was difficult to lie, but it wasn't difficult to shut up. This was especially the case when Zen Master suddenly remembered Jingzhou's letter from 100 years ago, insisting that he learn the silent meditation. "Can I sit here alone for a while?" he asked Xingju. Xingju thought that he wanted to experience the place where Jingzhou had once lived, so he naturally wouldn't refuse. He turned and left. Lu Shui sat on the sofa. After confirming that there was no one near the residential building, he took out a device and connected to the network of a light battleship. Then, he jumped from the military network to the common network of the star region. He found an ordinary node and very normally connected to the game of the path toward heaven. The vegetables in the fields hadn't been watered, but they hadn't turned yellow. The pickle jars in the kitchen hadn't been taken care of, but the water on the sides of the jars hadn't dried up, and the pickles inside hadn't gone bad. More importantly, no matter how long the pickles had been soaked in the water, as long as one modified the settings, they would be able to taste like the pickles in the water. This place was a small vegetable garden outside the Guoqing temple. After coming to this world, Lu Shui would come here to have a meal when he entered the game once in a while. That day, he was in the room in Building 720, which had no network and no gaming compartment. He could see everything in the game, but he couldn't perceive it. As such, he didn't cook a meal for himself. All he did was smack his lips a few times. The door of the kitchen was pushed open with a squeak. Zhao Lei walked in. Seeing Jingju squatting in front of the pickle jars, she arched her eyebrows slightly, but she didn't say anything. Lu Shui got up and asked her worriedly, "You've been staring at that computer the entire time, so she must be staring at you as well. Will it be alright if you come in like this?" Ran Handong said it would be alright. Zhao Lei liked eating hot pot and other dishes, but she preferred staying in the mountains and seas instead of the kitchen. She headed for the door. "It's not important. Let's talk about what happened on your side." Following behind her, Lu Shui told her about what had happened here, including the details. Then he said, "Young master has lived here for more than a year. His room is not large, but he has a cat. I think he has a good life here." He was not talking about the Guoqing temple in the game, but the residential building 720 where his real body was located. Having said all this, they had already flown to the deep end of the Guoqing temple. In the familiar tranquil garden. Looking at the stone pagoda surrounded by the fallen leaves, Zhao Lei said after a moment of silence. He didn't strike until he saw the old dragon and the mysterious dark devil fighting here back then. Why did you strike so early today? The sage Xing was on the verge of death, said Lu Shui. Zhao Lei said, "His fan is much better than the one given to you by the scholar Yen." Lu Shui suddenly realized that he hadn't returned the fan to Tsingju yet. Zhao Lei knew what was on his mind, saying, "Tsingju was still able to fight back then. You should have waited until both of them were wounded before you killed them." "The sage Xing is a good person," said Lu Shui. Zhao Lei asked, "Jingjiu was severely wounded by Li Chunyang's scheme. Did he say anything?" Lu Shui said after a moment of silence, "You shouldn't kill him so easily." Zhao Lei asked. Lu Shui couldn't help but say, "Back at the South Pine Pavilion, my young master said that you only know how to fly fast when he saw you riding the sword for the first time. I'll be safe from now on. I scared him. Did he tell you about it?" Zhao Lei said in a mocking tone, "Besides, it's not like he's always right." This was the different attitude she, Lu Shui, Gu Qing, and the others had toward Jingjiu. Back in the Guoqing temple, she was ready to break through the state, but Jingjiu thought it was too fast and asked her to suppress it until the critical moment when they were chasing after Taiping Zhenren. At that time, she no longer suppressed her state of mind and state, and broke through the state in the dangerous battle, thus embarking on her own path. At that time, Lu Shui was by her side. She hadn't seen him many times, but they had killed Lo Huainan and Taiping Zhenren together, and served Jingjiu in the Guoqing temple, so they were familiar and close. Looking at his silent appearance and thinking of that matter, she couldn't help but feel pity for him, saying, "My condolences." After hundreds of years, Lu Shui was still a 10-year-old boy, but he was no longer a boy. The pickle jar in the kitchen of the vegetable garden had been left unattended. Zen Master said that she could be buried in the temple, but I thought she wouldn't agree, so I built it in the vegetable garden. At the time of her funeral, Tong Yen had just ascended, so Gu Qing came back to offer his condolences. The treasured boat couldn't stop in time and crashed into the new cliff by the heavenly well, creating many waves. Lu Shui continued, "I guarded the grave for several years. I thought you and my young master might need me, so I came out." Chapter 967. In the human society, guarding the grave was a very important matter. How one should guard the grave for one's parents and elders, and what clothes one should wear. In recent years, there were many complicated rules and regulations. Though Lu Shui was a scholar, he was actually a cultivation practitioner, so he didn't care about these things. 400 years ago in Chaotian, he had finished his studies in Yamatsai. After asking his teacher, Bu Qiuxiao, he stayed by the grave of his big brother Shiyun for 3 years. 3 years later, he asked Xiao He to end her business in the inn and leave the 1,000-mile wind corridor. He went overseas to persuade Gu Qing to come back, but he failed. Later, he and Xiao He returned to the Guoqing temple and lived in the vegetable garden for a few years. In the spring of the 2nd year, Zhao Liu came and asked him to go back to Oyama as well. What she said was that it seemed that Bu Qiuxiao wouldn't leave for a while, and since he couldn't be the housemaster, it was better for him to go back to Oyama. Xiao He was cooking in the kitchen. She didn't even dare to listen to the conversation, let alone voice her opinion. The vixen didn't have the saying that the man should be the outsider and the woman should be the insider. It was not that she couldn't defeat Lu Shui, but that she was afraid of Zhao Liu. After Jing Jiu ascended and left, her fear of him was transferred to Zhao Lei. She felt uneasy whenever she saw this woman, so she didn't want to see her at all. Lu Shui said, "I was expelled from the mountain gate before. It's a bit weird to go back openly." Zhao Liu didn't take it seriously, saying, "Just let Zhuoruzhui write the notice to be the sect master. If you think it's inconvenient," as Lu Shui was about to say that it was inconvenient, he heard what she said next. "Let's kick out Zhuoruzhui and let you be the sect master. After all, you're the orthodox disciple of our Shenma Peak." Lu Shui couldn't help but sympathize with Zhuoruzhui. He thought that Zhuoruzhui shouldn't have freeloaded so many meals at Shenma Peak. Just then, another person walked into the vegetable garden. The sunlight shone through the locust tree and fell on the young face. His eyebrows were so faint that they were almost invisible. He said directly, "There is something wrong with Zhuoruzhui's head. He keeps finding trouble with me. If you want to replace him, you'd better do it as soon as possible. Otherwise, he will cause more problems in the future." Lu Shui didn't know why Zhao Liu and Tong Yen came to see him at the same time, but he could guess that they were going to discuss something important. He asked with a puzzled expression, "Didn't Peng Lang write back that he's fine over there? Are you really going to follow Bai Zhao's suggestion and fight in the snowfield?" Zhao Liu said, "We want to discuss the matters after our ascension." According to the usual practice, only one ascendant would appear in Chaotian every 1,000 years, but it seemed that the rule would be broken soon. The fairy books falling from the sky and landing in various places had solved many problems for this world. In Chaotian at the moment, the 3 of them and Zhuoruzhui had the highest chance of ascension, excluding the new queen and Peng Lang in the snowfield. Even so, it was still a bit overconfident or narcissistic to start thinking about the matters after their ascension a few hundred years in advance. It could be said that they had all been greatly influenced by Jingjiu. Tong Yen told them about her plan, and returned to Cloud Dream Mountain after that. Zhao Liu and Lu Shui talked about something else, and they didn't bid farewell until late at night. Standing in front of the vegetable garden, and looking at the light and steam in the kitchen, Zhao Liu said, "You knew she would die." Lu Shui fell silent for a long time, saying nothing. A few hundred years later, they had indeed ascended. They met again in the small vegetable garden, and then they came to the Guoqing temple. Sitting on the wooden floor under the corridor, Zhao Liu said, "It looks like we didn't miscalculate. Let's see how to solve the problem of the Snow Girl." The Snow Girl was the most powerful being in this universe. What problem did she have that needed help? Did Zhao Liu sit by the cliff's edge and stare at the young woman by the hot spring have something to do with it? Young Master said that history is basically repeating itself. After coming to this world, I found that it's true. The Grandmasters and the others are no different from Taiping Jinren. Lu Shui came to the front of the stone pagoda, pushed aside the fallen leaves, and took out a pickle jar. This was a hidden part designed in the game, and only someone like him could discover it. Zhao Lei raised her eyebrows slightly, saying, "Don't be obsessed with it." Lu Shisui said, "I'm not in the gaming cabin, so I know it's fake. You don't have to worry about me. On the contrary, I'm worried about Gu Qing." Yes, the pickle jar was fake, the pickles were fake, the cabbages in the vegetable garden, the locust trees, and the mulberry trees by the fields were all fake. The little fox had been dead for many years, and that old fox also didn't have many years left. Lu Shisui placed the pickle jar in a corner of the roofed corridor, believing that it would be easier to find. The two of them walked out of the Guoqing temple, passed through the village that was still filled with the remnants of the firecrackers and the smell of cured meat. By the time they reached the shore of the East Sea, the darkness of the night had already receded. Gu Qing's affection is deeper than yours, so she might really die with her, but Zheng Tao might not. Zhao Lei's tone was very calm, as if she were commenting on a painting. Lu Shisui knew that she was merciless and did not want to discuss the depth of affection with her, so he said, "Young master definitely hopes that they won't die and that they will all be well." The distant morning sun leapt out of the sea, as if agreeing with his statement. The sun set on the other side of the sea. The giant waved his hand, and a gale appeared in the sky, tearing down many strands of the clouds as if they were eating cotton candy. Those spirits with transparent wings were quite frightened, shouting and yelling at the giant's back. In any case, they knew that the giant had a gentle personality and would not mind. The treasured ship seemed to be moving slowly, but it was actually traveling at an incredible speed toward the other side of the blue sea. Very quickly, they threw these scenes and sounds to the back of their mind. A few days later, the treasured ship arrived at the famous secret border of the Singing Spring. Gu Qing stood at the bow of the ship, gazing at the huge whirlpool in the distance that had changed beyond recognition, listening to the thunderous sound of the water, and very naturally thought of the past. Back then, after his master used his supreme divine ability to repair the huge whirlpool, he fainted. Later on, he led countless cultivation practitioners of various sects back and forth on land and sea, finally accomplishing this task. Empress Hu walked to his side and looked at the huge whirlpool in the distance, showing a hint of timidity on her face. "Don't let the ship get too close," she said. Even though she was a vixen with a high cultivation state, time had left some traces on her face. However, in comparison to Gu Qing, whose white hair was ruffled by the ocean wind and wrinkles appeared at the corners of his eyes, she looked much younger. It was as if the old and the young were a perfect match. Gu Qing was already a figure in the upper state of the heavenly arrival state, and his two wives had an exceedingly high cultivation state. As such, they had no need to worry about the treasured ship falling into the huge whirlpool. He was fully aware that his wife was merely pretending to be weak out of habit, so he didn't expose her like she had done in the past hundreds of years. He signaled for his disciples to steer the ship away. After passing the huge whirlpool, they arrived at the calm belt. The surface of the ocean was as calm as a mirror, or like a gloomy blue satin, until it was cut open by the treasured ship like a pair of scissors. Gu Qing recalled something that had happened many years ago. At the time at the Dao competition at the Zhongzhou school, everybody saw He Zhan walk on the surface of the ocean in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. "I don't think He Zhan will show up this time," Jingjiu said regretfully. It was said that He Zhan had been living in a small temple in White Town over the years, and that he had shown up less often in the cultivation circle than Jingjiu. Peng Lang is in the Snowy Kingdom now, and the Queen has never left the icy peak. The monster invasion is over. Why would he learn from Chao Yuan? All he wants is to hide from his wife. It's too much. Empress Hu said with a sneer, "If I were Sensei Da, I would go to the Guoqing temple and find Zen master to complain about him." Gu Qing let out a smile, as he thought that he should go to Yamatsai and find the Saint Bu if he wanted to complain about him. The relationship between He Zhan and Bu Qiuxiao had become a secret that nobody knew since Jingjiu ascended. However, Gu Qing was also in Zhaoga City back then, and he had been assisting his master by the side. He had figured out part of the truth after thinking about it for hundreds of years. Are we really going back to Aoyama? Empress Hu said uneasily. Why don't we just bring back the things Ping Yongka wants? Why do we have to go back? Time could make many things fade away, like love, the taste of the barbecued fish, and hatred, but this matter was a bit different. The master of the royal family had eloped with the royal dowager. Even though the Jing imperial court was not as powerful as before, what would the cultivation circle think of them if they returned to Aoyama? Moreover, those old people who were still alive all remembered that Gu Qing was the best candidate for the sect master of Aoyama sect in Jingjiu's mind. As such, Gu Qing and his two wives had seldom returned to Chaotian over the last hundreds of years for the sake of the reputation of the Jing imperial court and the Aoyama sect. The last time he went back was for Xiao He's funeral in Ying City. Xiao He's life was arranged by Jingjiu according to his master's order. The two of them often communicated with each other, and they had a good relationship. Moreover, he and his wife were from the same clan. It's been more than 500 years. I think it will fade away a bit. Besides, it's such an important matter that I can't feel at ease if I don't see it with my own eyes. Gu Qing combed his fluttering white hair behind his back and made it into a Taoist bun with an ebony chopstick. His movement was casual, but it was natural and graceful. Empress Hu knew that Jingjiu had made up his mind, so she said no more. You should go back to Aoyama in a few years. Even if you don't become the sect master, it's quite comfortable to be the great grandmaster on the Shinma Peak. There's no need to stay on the ocean, exposed to the wind and the sun. Gu Qing had achieved a high level of cultivation, but he looked so old. It was obvious that he did it on purpose. She had never mentioned it before, but she was aware of his intention. What she said was a response. Gu Qing was aware that she didn't want him to see her old appearance before her death. I don't like you because you're young, he said with a faint smile. Hundreds of years later, Jingjiu's words of love were more effective than before. Empress Hu spat a bit bashfully. It was then that Zhen Tao walked out from the cabin after lifting up the curtain. She happened to hear what Gu Qing said. Seeing her move, she sneered, "What a pair of adulterous lovers." Empress Hu let out a smile and held her hand, saying, "I've asked the West Mountain in Suzhou to send some fresh loquats to the East Ocean. I'll peel them for you." The godly boat arrived at Penglai Island before it arrived in Chaotian. In the meantime, at least hundreds of godly boats arrived at the harbor of this large island from all over the ocean, which was famous for its divine wood and shipping. Gu Qing led his two wives off the boat and walked toward the harbor. Listening to the conversations of the boatmen on the way, he found out that the fairy lady hadn't been seen on the ocean for many years. He thought that he couldn't be as heartless as his master. As they arrived at a fairy residence on Penglai Island, the boatmen from the other lands came to report to them one after another. With the help of the cultivation circle in Chaotian, the godly boats traveled more than 10 times faster than they had 500 years ago. Those foreign lands that had only existed in the legends had gradually become the objects in front of them, and they had become the appendages of Chaotian. For that important event, the West Wind continent and a few other continents and large islands had sent many rare resources to Chaotian, using the godly boats of Penglai Island. It was one thing for the boatmen to report to Gu Qing. In the end, the states would pay the bills themselves, or the Aoyama sect would make the final arrangements. The Aoyama sect had always made the arrangements for this kind of event. Gu Qing said seriously, "It's an honor for Penglai Island to participate in such an important event. Don't pay, otherwise it would be disrespectful to the King of Godly Boats." In the end, the King of Godly Boats of Penglai Island didn't get a penny. Zhen Tao didn't eat the rumored loquats either. It was not because Empress Hu didn't keep her promise. It was because their boat didn't land at the East Ocean. A few years ago, when Gu Qing brought them back to Chaotian to attend the funeral of Xiao He, the boat traveled too fast and didn't stop. As a result, the cliff wall outside the heavenly well was damaged. To ensure that the underworld energy of the underworld wouldn't leak out, Shuiyu Nunnery and the Guoqing Temple had spent a great deal of effort. Even the underworld had sent someone to help. As a result, nothing bad had happened. Because of this, Shuiyu Nunnery was very angry at Gu Qing. He didn't allow his boat to land at the shore. Of course, both the disciples of Shuiyu Nunnery and the people on the godly boats knew the real reason why Shuiyu Nunnery was angry at Gu Qing. It was because he had abducted the most talented and promising female disciple of Shuiyu Nunnery. Looking at the cliff of the East Ocean getting farther and farther away, Zhen Tao felt a bit sad. It had been more than 500 years. Were the seniors and sisters in the nunnery still unwilling to forgive her? Don't worry. When the nunnery master dies in a few years, nobody will dare stop you from coming back, Empress, who comforted her clumsily. Zhen Tao knew that she didn't mean it in a bad way, so she couldn't get angry. Instead, she laughed out loud. The godly boat didn't go far to the south before it reached the shore. The monks of the Guoqing Temple had been waiting for them at the dock. Gu Qing handed the important matter on the boat to the current chief monk of the instruction hall, and then he didn't pay any more attention to it. He went ashore with his 2 wives. The chief monk of the instruction hall looked at Empress, who, hesitating to say something. Empress, who also hesitated to say something. After a moment of hesitation, she said, "He still doesn't want to see me?" Her situation was even more troublesome than Zhen Tao's. Zhen Tao could wait for the nunnery master to die, but she didn't want to. Gu Qing patted her shoulder, saying, "Let's go back to Oyama first." Chapter 968. Gu Qing could have brought his 2 wives back with him, and it would have been much faster. It was just that he wanted to go on a sightseeing trip back to his homeland after so many years. Of course, it might also have something to do with homesickness. Therefore, he needed a carriage now. The Gu clan had received the news in advance. From the clan leader to the child who was less than 2 months old, everyone was waiting for him on the shore. The Gu clan was still one of the top clans in Tiannan. Judging from the status of Shenma Peak in the Aoyama sect, it would last for at least 1,000 years. Seeing Gu Qing's figure, tens of thousands of people knelt down like a tide, but there was no sound. The scene was extremely spectacular. The carriage behind the crowd was even more eye-catching. Gu Qing waved his hand and did not say anything. He got into the carriage with his 2 wives. The roof of the carriage was hollow and was inlaid with an extremely precious crystal. The area of the window was also very large. As for the material of the carriage and the breed of the horse, it was needless to say. The carriage was very spacious. There were 2 soft couches facing each other. The floor was covered with an expensive carpet, and there were good wine and tea on the tea table. There were all kinds of snacks inside. Zhen Tao had been cultivating in the Shuiyu Nunnery since she was a child, and had traveled on the sea for hundreds of years. Her life was free and beautiful, but she had never experienced such prosperity in the human world. She could not help but be a little surprised. Empress, who had lived in the palace for a long time and had seen all the prosperity in the human world. She also felt that this carriage was a little too luxurious. She reminded him carefully, "We have been back for so long, there must be many people watching us. Isn't it not good to be so ostentatious?" Gu Qing lay comfortably on the couch and looked at the shadows of trees and white clouds passing by through the skylight. He thought of the past and said slowly, "Don't worry, this is Master's." The carriage left Donghai and entered Machio. The official road outside the Guoqing Temple was still full of carriages and tents on both sides. The monk doctor walked slowly between the carriages and tents with the help of the folk doctors and officials. There were not many changes in the world. At least, for ordinary people, birth, aging, sickness, and death were still normal. However, there were some changes in the end. For example, the number of patients who suffered from external injuries was much less. This meant that in recent years, the Jing dynasty's management of the world was rather good. Just like that, the carriage traveled between the various states and counties. It wasn't considered a private visit because the three of them didn't have any status at the moment. Looking at the peaceful world outside the window, Gu Qing was very pleased. Although he did not manage Aoyama well according to his teacher's instructions, everything was fine. More than 10 days later, the carriage rushed into a thick fog that could not be dispersed. Faint voices of people came from the front. It was actually a town. After returning to Cloudy Town, of course, he couldn't miss a very important thing. Instead of going to Scenery Garden outside the town to enjoy the scenery like the other tourists, he went to that restaurant to eat hot pot. The current owner of the restaurant was a young master, and he would occasionally receive a few immortal masters of Green Mountain. He could recite the booklet given to him by his father before his death. He recognized the horse-drawn carriage as soon as he saw it. He was extremely nervous, and he bowed to the ground in front of the carriage. Gu Qing got off the carriage. Looking at the antique restaurant, he asked with a smile, "Do you recognize this carriage?" The young owner plucked up the courage to look at him and asked, "Is the surname of the immortal Master Gu?" Gu Qing was even more surprised and asked, "How did you recognize it?" The young owner answered honestly, "My father gave me a booklet before he passed away." The faces of several immortal masters were drawn on it. Gu Qing was very interested and asked, "Is it convenient for me to see it?" The red and white yuanyang pot waited quietly for the moment of boiling. Empress Hu and Zhen Tao stared at the hot pot and kept cheering in their hearts, of course for their half-pot of soup. Zhen Tao thought the white soup would boil more easily. Empress Hu didn't know why, but she subconsciously thought it should be the red pot. Gu Qing took the booklet and slowly turned it over. Looking at the yellowed paper and the familiar faces, he remained silent. Zhao Liu, Lu Shui himself, Yuan Chu, Zhuoruzhui, Apiao, Kanyang. Some of them had already ascended, and some of them had always been here. He was the only one who had come back after so many years. It was very quiet in the compartment and the atmosphere was a bit depressing. The young owner became more and more uneasy and said in a trembling voice, "If it's not appropriate, I'll burn the booklet." "They're not dead yet. Why would you burn it?" Gu Qing said calmly. At this moment, the booklet happened to turn to the last page. There was a picture of a sword fairy in white, but his face was blank. He thought silently, "Shifu, how are you now?" The carriage was left in Cloudy Town, just like it had been 500 years ago, and the Gu clan would take care of it. Gu Qing and his 2 wives leapt up on the sword. He took out the sword board that he hadn't used for many years and arrived above the sword washing stream through the great formation of Aoyama. The important event would take place in a few days. The guests of many sects had arrived in advance, and the disciples of various peaks were busy entertaining the guests at Shilai Peak. No one noticed his return amidst the chaos. It was interesting that this was the first time Empress who had come to the Aoyama sect, so she couldn't help but feel nervous. Perhaps to conceal her nervousness, she asked while looking at the stream that looked like a golden whip, "Is this the divine whip used by the immortal to beat the fairy lady?" Gu Qing assented, and then introduced the other peaks to her, such as the magic pills and books on Shuriwa Peak, the files on Shilai Peak, the ocean of clouds on Tianguang Peak, and Qingrong Peak, which she should never go to. Jing Tao had been to Aoyama before, so she didn't need any introduction. She raised her eyebrows a bit higher. It was unclear if she was still angry about the quarrel in the restaurant earlier. It didn't take long before the sword of the universe landed on the top of Shenma Peak. The desolate energy became warmer. It was unclear if the sword had a spirit of its own. Yuan Chu knew that Jingju would arrive today, so he waited by the cliff's edge in advance. "Greetings, big brother. Did you enjoy the hot pot?" he greeted with a smile. Though he hadn't seen Jingjiu for more than 500 years, he merely greeted him nonchalantly. However, the young brother who was like a monkey back then had white hair on his temples, and his bearing was much steadier now. Gu Qing felt a bit sentimental, saying, Okay. Let me introduce you to your two sisters-in-law. You have met them before. As Jingjiu was talking, he unexpectedly heard the argument between Empress Hu and Zheng Tao. The red soup should have been boiled first. How could it be the white soup? Sister, you have to give us a reason. What's more, we saw clearly that the soup was boiled together. I didn't do it right, and neither did you. Well, you must be young brother Yuan Chu, right? You've been in charge of Shangda Peak for many years, and you're the sword justice of Aoyama. You're the most impartial judge. Please say something. The look on Gu Qing's face was a bit unsightly, but he didn't dare to let Yuan Chu make a judgment. He waved his hands to signal his two wives to go to the manor cave for a tour, and then he dragged Yuan Chu to the upper floor of the Taoist hall. Yuan Chu looked at Jingjiu and said with a spurious smile, We've had so many hot pot meals back then, and we all know that the red soup should be boiled first. But why did the two sisters-in-law see that the soup was boiled together? Gu Qing said with a straight face, A bowl of water should be leveled, and a pot of soup should be boiled together. What he said revealed a clear message. Jingjiu must have done something at that time. A figure in the heavenly arrival state should have used the divine method on hot pot. What kind of logic was this? Yuan Chu said helplessly, Big brother, why did you do this? Gu Qing didn't want to discuss this issue, so he asked, How are you and Yushan? Yuan Chu said, We're fine. Our daughter is now at the South Pine Pavilion. Though she's not of natural Tao quality, her aptitude is better than ours. She should enter the Hall of Sword Washing next year. Generally speaking, cultivation practitioners would only choose to leave their bloodline after they were sure that the great path was hopeless and that they could see the end. But this practice gradually changed with the appearance of Taiping Jinren. Yuan Chu and Yushan had this daughter partly because they had a close relationship, but more importantly, it was because those brothers on Shanghai Peak were looking forward to having a female disciple. In the last few hundred years of Aoyama's inherited sword competition, no female disciple was willing to join Shanghai Peak. Gu Qing had been abroad for many years, but he had kept up communication with Aoyama, so he knew all this. So he didn't worry about his young brothers, but he couldn't figure it out. Those brothers are already elders. Why are they still making trouble? He asked. Yuan Chu said helplessly, Shanghai Peak has become a black jade plate, and the Master Night Howler lies on it all day long. Our brothers don't even have a manor cave. What are they doing? There was a saying in the cultivation circle of Chaotian that the 9 peaks of Aoyama were all Shangda Peak. It was because Taiping Jinren, the immortal Jingyang, Lu Ci, and Yuan Qijing all came from this peak. However, Shanghai Peak was destroyed after the epic battle between the Fairy Lady, Bai Ren, and the Snow Girl. As a result, the disciples of Shangda Peak felt like the orphans of Aoyama. Gu Qing felt surprised, asking, Didn't they decide to build another peak back then? Senior Master Qi Yan led the others to search among the peaks for more than 10 years, but they couldn't find a good spiritual source, Yuan Chu said. Gu Qing said, Didn't Fu Wang say that Shanghai Peak should go to the West Ocean? The spiritual energy there is abundant and it's a very large place. Shanghai Peak is in charge of the sword justice and responsible for the examination of the inner disciples. The West Ocean is so far away. How can we do it if we move there? Yuan Chu said with raised eyebrows. Besides, why should we go there? Why can't they let Shilai Peak move there and give Shilai Peak to us? Gu Qing finally understood, thinking that it was too troublesome. Fortunately, he had run away fast enough back then. In the beginning, Senior Master Guangyuan didn't care much about these things, and he wasn't good at dealing with these things either. Later, when Zhuoruzhui became the sect master, he became the round turtle. He said nice things like giving Tianguang Peak to me. Can I take it? It was obvious that Yuan Chu had also thought of Gu Qing. Listening to the conversation between the two sisters-in-law in the manor cave, he looked at Gu Qing and said with a sigh, "Why do you have to do this? If you hadn't left, the position of the sect master would have been yours. You would have dealt with these things properly, and it wouldn't be as troublesome as it is now. You might even have a chance to ascend." Gu Qing said, "Everything in the world is uncertain. Who can say for sure?" Just like He Zhan and Sensei, everyone thought that their love was stronger than gold, but what happened now? Yuan Chu felt a headache thinking about the couple. Suddenly, he heard a message from the sword letter saying that an important guest had arrived, so he had to leave for the time being. He said, "Senior brother, you can rest in the peak. If you want to go to other peaks, it's fine. I'll come back to chat with you when I'm done with the things at hand." Gu Qing waved his hand to let him go. The zigzagging plum sword came out from the cliff's edge and went to Tianguang Peak. Gu Qing walked to the cliff's edge and looked at the peaks poking out of the sea of clouds. He wondered where he should go if he wanted to go. He had many acquaintances in Aoyama back then, but not many of them were still alive. Lei Ilkyung and Yao Songshan had left more than 100 years ago. Guananshan was still alive, but his elder brother Gu Han and Lin Yuanji had also left. So many of the former disciples of the third generation had left, not to mention those masters. Elder Mo Qi and Senior Master Mei Li had passed away many years ago. Fang Jingtian had died without a sound. Heaven and earth had sensed his death, but it hadn't attracted much attention. Senior Master Qi Yen had lost an arm at the West Ocean, but his cultivation hadn't been delayed. Instead, he had lived a few more years. 170 years ago, Guanyuan Zhenren failed to ascend. He turned into a gust of gentle wind on the stone bridge between Shiyue Peak and Shilai Peak. The gentle wind sent the sword into Yunqing Peak. This former swordsman of the sword had bid farewell to Oyama. What was the point of going to those peaks when he was gone? Empress Hu and Jing Tao walked out of the manor cave and felt very sad when they saw Jingjiu standing by the cliff's edge. They shut their mouths reflexively. In fact, they quarreled from the restaurant to Shinma Peak because they were worried that Gu Qing would miss the old man too much. They had sensed something wrong with Jingjiu a long time ago, before the ship arrived at Penglai. They had lived together for hundreds of years, so it was impossible for them not to feel it. As they were about to come over and comfort him, they suddenly heard the cries of monkeys coming from the bottom of the cliff. In the beginning, it was only a small monkey that was calling out, full of surprise and curiosity. It was because Shinma Peak hadn't had any guests for a long time. Soon after, a few big monkeys were calling out. They found that the man standing by the cliff's edge seemed to be a part of Shinma Peak, and he didn't look like a guest at all. The monkeys' cries grew louder, and the shaking of the treetops grew louder, like the rustling of the pines. The corners of Gu Qing's mouth curled up, and he said, "Long time no see." Hundreds of monkeys came out from the forest, either squatting on the ground or rubbing their backs against the rocks, looking at Jingjiu curiously. In their eyes, this man was a stranger, as if they had never seen him before. But why did he feel so familiar? They regarded the monkeys as human beings. Was this the so-called collective unconscious? A small monkey plucked up its courage and jumped onto the cliff's edge, calling out to Gu Qing in a low voice. Empress Hu and Jing Tao eyed each other, feeling perplexed, wondering what these monkeys wanted to do. "I don't know where I come from," Gu Qing said to the small monkey earnestly. "I'm a native of this place." Chapter 969. Of course, Gu Qing could understand what the monkeys were talking about. He didn't know any of the hundreds of monkeys on the cliff, but he knew their ancestors and was very close to them. He and the ancestors of these monkeys were companions and workmates. This small wooden house was built by me and the monkeys. Gu Qing took his 2 wives to the bottom of the cliff and pointed at the cabin, saying, later on, this was the meeting hall. The elders of the peaks would discuss anything here. Jing Tao asked, is it the cabin where you put a lot of green tea? Gu Qing said, in the beginning, I put black tea in it. The monkeys who followed them here began to cry in the trees. Gu Qing didn't pay any attention to them. He led them to other places in the peaks for a tour, and he introduced a nameless stream to them. The horse was raised here. Junior brother Yuan Chu and Ping Yongka often carried bricks here. Are the rules of Shinma Peak so strict? It's senior master aunt who wants to try her sword. Zhao Liu is as fierce as the rumors say. After so many years, you still call her senior master aunt. Didn't you change it to senior master sister? Master said in Scenery Garden that everything should be the same. Immortal Jingyang indeed has a temperament that doesn't care about anything. It's laziness. The family of 3 chatted casually. It didn't take long for them to finish visiting Shinma Peak. Among the 9 peaks of Aoyama, Shinma Peak was the loneliest with no scenic spots. Now there was not even a single person. Zhao Liu ascended and became an immortal. Ping Yongka spent most of his time sleeping in the Sword Peak. Yuan Chu took turns to handle the affairs of the sect in each peak. They didn't accept any disciples either. Gu Qing felt a little emotional. When he returned to the peak, he found a visitor and remembered what the monkeys had said. There was no one on Shinma Peak now, so the visitor was naturally here to see him. The yellow-robed middle-aged man looked at him with a complicated expression. When he saw the 2 girls behind him, his expression became even more complicated than the endless sword art. Gu Qing and Empress who guessed who it was and felt a little awkward. Finally, it was Jing Tao who broke the silence and said, you guys can talk among yourselves. I'm going to the cave to look for some sword scriptures. After saying this, she entered the cave dwelling. The middle-aged man knelt down in front of Empress Hu and said, greetings, grandmother. Empress Hu was a little excited but also a little uneasy. She stepped forward and helped him up, saying, you must be Qing. Yes, this yellow-robed middle-aged man was the current divine emperor Jing Qing. His father, Jing Yao, had seen through the mortal world many years ago and followed his grandfather to become a monk in the Guoqing temple. Of course, it was extremely difficult to see through the mortal world completely. Otherwise, how could he not see his biological mother when she came to Machio? Divine Emperor Jing Qing and Empress Hu said a few words and then turned to look at Gu Qing. After hesitating for a while, he bowed to a disciple and said, Jing Qing greets the Grandmaster. Gu Qing used to be the imperial preceptor, so of course, he was his Grandmaster. No matter what happened later, the imperial court could not deny this out of respect for the Aoyama sect. Empress Hu took her grandson's hand and went to the Taoist temple to talk. Gu Qing stood on the edge of the cliff and said to the sea of clouds, what are you doing? A plum blossom bloomed in the sea of clouds. Yuan Chu stepped on his sword and said with a smile, how can I stop the reunion of grandfather and grandson? Gu Qing snorted. If you are the sect master, it doesn't matter whether you hum or snort. Don't give me a face at this time. Yuan Chu teased. Besides, a grandmother and a grandmaster, don't you think they are a good match? The Shangda Peak had become a black jade plate, covering a large area. Countless clouds and fog were drifting on it. The black dead dog was like a small hill, crouching in the center of the black jade plate, letting the clouds and fog pass through his hair. He didn't do anything. He had been watching Aoyama in silence for more than 500 years. In fact, the dead dog and the black jade plate that the Shangda Peak had become were truly a good match. Once in a while, the clouds and fog would disperse and the sunlight would shine in. The dead dog would turn his body slowly to show that he was basking in the sun. 200 years ago, the dead dog sneezed while basking in the sun. The strong wind whipped up, and the clouds and fog on the Sword Peak were almost blown away. Even Cloudy Town 100 miles away had revealed its true appearance. The cultivation circle in Chaotian had been guessing how high his cultivation state was. Anyway, the unicorn had behaved himself on the Cloud Dream Mountain over the years. He didn't dare object when Tong Yen went to Zhaoga City to retrieve the stomach of the old dragon. As long as the dead dog sat on the black jade plate for a day, nobody dared step on it. The disciples of various peaks would only salute him from a distance when they passed by him, and then leave respectfully. However, the situation had changed a great deal in the last few days. Though the dead dog was still sitting in the same spot, many disciples of Aoyama had gradually climbed onto the black jade plate. They brought some objects from various places and started to construct the formations on the edges of the black jade plate. As the disciples of other sects came, the scene became more and more lively. Qingrong Peak, which was usually the busiest, was a bit quiet these days. It was because Nan Wang had been sitting on the peak top the entire time. There was also a black rock here, though it was much smaller than the one dead dog sat on. However, it was much more comfortable to sit on because of the shade provided by the flowering trees. Her cultivation state was immeasurably high, and her appearance was still as beautiful and naive as before. Yet, the alcohol jar held by her 2 fingers was still the same. Looking at the bustling scene in the distance, she asked with raised eyebrows, "How many more days will it take to finish? I've been basking in the sun here every day. It's really annoying." As she asked the question, a dust dragon came out from the Sword Peak and descended the mountain abruptly, arriving on the top of Qingrong Peak. The flying sword of the fairy state couldn't catch up with such a speed. It was truly unimaginable. However, the disciples of Aoyama were used to seeing such a scene, so they bowed nervously to the tail of the dust dragon only because they had just entered the gate and weren't used to it yet. Ping Yongka patted off the dust on his body, ignoring the mud on his face. He said to Nan Wang in a friendly tone, "The Zhongzhou school has a fairy book, and you have the highest cultivation state and seniority in the school. So you have to keep it in your hands, otherwise who would feel at ease?" "Hurry up," Nan Wang snapped impatiently. Ping Yongka thought that nobody had any experience in constructing the great formation of heavenly arrival, so how could it be done so quickly? He suddenly thought of something and asked uncertainly, "Great Grandmaster, are you really not?" Nan Wang raised the alcohol jar and interrupted him, saying, "Don't. You're the real Great Grandmaster." "Let's not talk about this," Ping Yongka said with a bitter expression. "What I meant was, are you really not going out?" "Why should I go out? Go out and watch him flirt with girls everywhere in the fairy world? You guys don't need to worry about that guy. Nothing can happen to him." Nan Wang picked up the alcohol jar and drank a mouthful of it, saying with a sneer, "Moreover, I don't need him to send someone to pick me up. If I want to ascend, I have to go out by myself." The intentional footsteps broke out on the stone path. She glanced in that direction and said mockingly, "Not everyone is as useless as this guy." Gu Qing came to the top of Qingrong Peak to greet the masters. He knew that Nan Wang didn't like him very much, so he wouldn't bring his wife with him. Ping Yongka bowed to Jing Jiu solemnly, saying, "Big brother, you've finally come back." Gu Qing said with a faint smile, "You ran past me as soon as I arrived at the foot of the Sword Peak, so I couldn't stop you." Ping Yongka's running speed couldn't be described as fast as a galloping horse or as swift as a thunderbolt. It was many times faster. Nan Wang said, "Even if you want to talk about the old days, don't do it here. I hate those stinky two-timing men the most." Ping Yongka said innocently, "I'm not stinky at all." Nan Wang said expressionlessly, "Actually, you're not necessarily a man." Gu Qing said with a faint smile, "I only take one boat on the ocean." Nan Wang sneered, "So what if you have a bed? You'll still have to sleep with me." The 2 brothers were speechless. They knew that she had drunk a bit too much wine that day, and would probably start singing a tune in the next moment. After bowing to Jingjiu, they left the mountain in a hurry. All of a sudden, they were blinded by a flash of golden light in the distance. It was not the sword-washing stream, but the location of the Shangda Peak. The edges of the huge black jade plate had been cut open by the flying swords a few thousand times. The inside of the plate was filled with golden water, glinting under the sunlight. Looking at it from a distance on Qingrong Peak, it looked like the complicated and exquisite golden lines. This was the edge of the formation. The flying swords and carriages descended from the peaks and the sky, bringing countless crystals and all kinds of precious treasures. If you hadn't scavenged for them overseas for 3 months, we might not have enough, said Ping Yongka. How many of you are going to go this time? Asked Gu Qing. The great formation of heavenly arrival had been repaired with the help of Chaotian and other lands and a great deal of resources. It would be meaningless if only one of them could go. I have to stay here to look after the house for my master, so I can't go. You said in the letter that you don't want to go either, and Peng Lang's daughter is still young. Ping Yongka couldn't figure it out even though he counted with his fingers for a long while. He was too lazy to do it again. Pointing to a Taoist nun in a green dress on the black jade plate, he said, "Now I'm sure that big sister Kanyang will go." The Taoist nun in a green dress was the great grandmaster of the mirror sect, Kanyang. Of course, she was more famous because of her historical status in the chess playing and her relationship with Jingjiu. Back when Jingjiu went to the mirror sect to study the method of splitting mirrors and to calculate the formation of dispersed smoke and clouds, she had been by his side. Now that she was the most outstanding grandmaster of formations in Chaotian, the Aoyama sect entrusted the most important task of presiding over the formation to her. After all, she was not an outsider. Zhao Liu, Tong Yen and the others had ascended, but Ping Yongka was guarding the southern part of Chaotian. The little snow girl was as powerful as ever in the north. Peng Lang was traveling between the north and the south. Su Zai was carrying the flag in the northwest. Bai Zhao could be seen intermittently outside the Penglai Island, and Gu Qing was sweeping across all the lands. The alliance was still as peaceful as before. There was a saying that the 9 peaks of Aoyama were all Shangda Peak. As such, it could be said that all the sects in Chaotian were all Aoyama sect. Senior Master. The disciples of Aoyama bowed to the beautiful and tranquil Taoist nun in green after putting the crystals and magic treasures into the grooves on the black jade plate. Kanyang was not a member of the Aoyama sect, but she was a member of the Aoyama sect. They were all well aware of her status in terms of generation and position. All the magic treasures in Chaotian and the other foreign lands were sent to Aoyama and placed on the black jade plate. It was evident that the magic treasures on the edge of the plates were the Gathering Spirits formations, but what would the Gathering Spirits formations look like when thousands of them were put together? What would the formations in the center of the black jade plates be when they were finished? Gu Qing didn't disturb Kanyang in setting up the formations. He bowed to the master dead dog from a distance, and then went to the Sword Peak with Ping Yongka and brought his 2 wives back to the Shima Peak. Nan Wang looked like a little girl, but she was actually more than 1,000 years old and the only remaining elder of the second generation. If the southern barbaric tribes didn't have an endless supply of incense, she would have been at the last moment and had to choose to ascend or something else. She was still fond of drinking alcohol and speaking in a domineering manner, but she wasn't as unruly as she used to be. Perhaps it was because she didn't have anyone to be unruly anymore. Qingrong Peak didn't require the great formation of Aoyama to be opened at the right time to let in the spring wind, autumn rain, and winter snow. Living on the top of the Shinma Peak, one didn't notice the passing of time even though the clouds rolled and the flowers bloomed and withered. The Jing Emperor hadn't left yet. More and more sect masters and elders of various sects came to Aoyama with the precious objects. The huge black jade plate became more and more crowded. The golden lines extended from the edge to the deep part of the plate, looking like a complicated river or a large painting taking shape. Sitting in the middle of the black jade plate, the dead dog showed an appreciative expression in his eyes as he watched the disciples of various sects busy with their work and the pattern-like golden lines. The appreciative expression was directed at Cain Yang and her assistants. This great formation was more complicated than the great formation of Zhaoga City and the great formation at the bottom of the Gathered Soul Valley, and it was more complicated than the long formation on the edge of the snowland. Such a great formation had never appeared in Chaotian. Cain Yang had studied it for hundreds of years and prepared for it for more than 100 years, but she still encountered many problems. She didn't show any frustration, nervousness, or disappointment when encountering those problems. All she did was discuss with her assistants calmly about the modification of the formation. Those assistants came from the Platonist sect, the Mirror sect, the Guoqing Temple, the Zhongzhou school, and the Aoyama sect. All of them were young disciples. Hundreds of cultivation practitioners of the young generation who were good at calculation and formations sat on the black jade plate. Their gazes followed Cain Yang's hand to look at the huge light screen, calculating and reconstructing the formation. What kind of formation was this? Yuan Chu, Ping Yongka, and Guananshan were in charge of receiving the guests of various sects and arranging the receiving of the magic treasures, magic pills, and crystals, so they were quite busy. When they saw the scenes on the black jade plate once in a while, like the dead dog, they would show an appreciative expression in their eyes. It was not an expression of affection or praise for the disciples of the younger generation, but a feeling of contentment or happiness. Normally, talent was merely a matter of probability, and the natural cultivation path was still rare. But why was the current cultivation circle so much stronger than before? Before Jingzhi left Chaotian, he had made an agreement with the immortal Tan, Jian Shilai, Chao Yuan and the others about what to do next, and he sent a few fairy books back to them. Now that he thought about it, Bai Ren left 6 fairy books in order to stabilize the boundary between Chaotian and the outside world. The energy of heaven and earth in Chaotian was very abundant at the moment, and some of the dried-up spiritual sources even showed signs of regeneration. This was only one of the reasons. More importantly, the research and innovation of the magic methods in the cultivation circle had progressed at an unimaginable speed. The cultivation circle was also divided into different sects, but it lacked the sectarian bias. The scenes where the various sects gathered together to discuss the formations were a common sight at the plum meeting and the Tao competition. The various sects communicated with each other and used the magic methods to communicate with each other. As a result, the progress was much faster. Why didn't sectarian bias exist anymore? It was because the sects had lost their meaning. The Wanzhong Chaotian belonged to the Aoyama sect. In other words, those people left behind by Jingzhou were the rulers of this world. Since they were all brothers and sisters, there was no need to differentiate between them and you. The cultivation circle in Chaotian had experienced the best period in its history, and it was also the period in which the progress was the fastest. The overall strength of the cultivation circle had improved a lot. Judging from this, the humans didn't need to do what Tai Pingzhenren and Bai Yuan had done. They could still find other ways to make themselves stronger. Regardless of whether it was the fortune left behind by Jingzhou or the natural phenomena, Chaotian had entered the era of cultivation. Besides Lu Shisui, Zhao Liu and Tong Yen, more and more ascendants would appear. Yet, Chaotian still knew very little about the outside world. The fairy books could only store the pure fairy energy, so they couldn't carry the information to travel through time. The Cloud Dream Mountain must have a secret method, but it was kept a secret. A few years ago, the new sect master of the Zhongzhou school had finally dealt with the old man in the back valley, and then cut off contact with Aoyama, which gave rise to many speculations. It wasn't until half a year ago that the new sect master suddenly wrote a letter to them. Ping Yongka and Yuan Chu didn't dare slight it, and reported it to Nan Wang. Back when Lu Ci blocked the heavenly punishment for Taipingzhenren by the West Ocean, Nan Wang said that he would kill Tong Yen no matter what. Though it was inconvenient to kill her later, he was still wary of that insidious guy and felt that there must be something fishy about him. However, he agreed to the mission after seeing the fairy book attached to the letter. Ping Yongka and Yuan Chu were fully aware that Tong Yen had encountered some trouble in the letter, so there was no way she wouldn't agree to send someone out. One early morning, the great formation of Aoyama opened a passage in the south, ushering in thousands of rays of morning sunlight and spring rain. The raindrops fell on the peaks and wetted the black jade plate, making it look even gloomier, like an eye gazing at the sky. The dead dog was the spirit of this eye, as tranquil as a mountain. The representatives of various sects and the imperial court had all arrived, and the formation was almost finished. Hundreds of highly achieved monks were reciting scripts on one side, and hundreds of Taoist priests were meditating on the other. The spring wind and rain brushed against the 200 clean heart bells hanging on the trees outside the black jade plate, giving off a crisp and pleasant sound. The elders of the Platonist sect had never seen such a scene. They stroked their beards with a faint smile, thinking that their sect master would tell them about the scene that day after he returned to Morning Lake. The rain fell and the wind rose. The morning sunlight arrived, and the thin fog enshrouding the black jade plate was blown away, revealing the entire appearance of the great formation. Innumerable notches extended from the edge to the innermost part of the formation, and the middle of the notches was twisting and turning, as if the rivers and streams were flowing willfully. However, if one looked closely, they would find that the direction and changes of those lines were in accordance with a certain natural law, giving off an indescribable sense of beauty. A great deal of flowing gold was flowing slowly in the notches, filling every notch in the area of 10 square miles. Illuminated by the distant morning sunlight, the golden liquid emitted sparkles that looked like crystals. It should be the broken pieces of crystals mixed in it. The crystals were a precious source of energy for the regular cultivation practitioners, but they were ground up and used as a coating. This was no different from when Yuan Chu gave the ocean pearl on the Shinma Peak to young sister Yushan in secret. It was an extravagant act that defied the natural order. However, this great formation of heavenly arrival was a formation that defied the natural order. The prototype of this formation was the formation of dissipating smoke and clouds set up on the Shinma Peak by the immortal Jingyang when he ascended, but it was more than 1,000 times larger, and had been modified in many ways by Cain Yang and those young, talented disciples. Of course, these modifications were also based on the supreme wisdom left behind by Jingjiu. The name of the formation and its origin came from the heavenly arrival of slaying formations set up by Taipingzhenren near the giant whirlpool when the world was destroyed. However, the trajectory and intent of the formation were completely opposite. Everything was ready, but no one knew when it would start. The current elder Shuei Nunnery had been holding a peach blossom branch, and the petals on the branch had been falling slowly. 2 more petals fell off, leaving only one lonely petal. She walked to the edge of the black jade plate and handed the peach blossom branch to Ping Yongka. Ping Yongka took the peach blossom branch and inserted it into his waist like a sword. Looking at the thousands of cultivation practitioners among the peaks, he asked, "Who is going to ascend today?" Chapter 970. Ascension was neither a treat to a meal nor an outing. It was the lifelong dream of the cultivation practitioners, the end of the path toward heaven, and the most difficult thing in the world. Only a few dozen ascendants had appeared in Chaotian over the last tens of thousands of years. Could it be that anyone who wanted to ascend could ascend today? Of course, not everyone could ascend if they wanted to. It was merely a dream for everyone. Even if the great formation of heavenly arrival could open a passage, it would be very risky, and they might have to face the heavenly punishment. Few people were qualified to enter this great formation. They had to be at least in the heavenly arrival state. Kane Young said calmly, "I'd like to go and have a look." She was the controller of this great formation of heavenly arrival, so she had to be in the middle of the formation. Moreover, she was a chess player, so she wanted to see the world outside the chessboard the most. Soon after, Yuan Chu and young sister Yushan also came forward, causing the cultivation practitioners among the peaks to whisper among themselves. It was well known that Yuan Chu, the sect master of the Shanghai peak of the Aoyama sect, had the most ordinary talent among the disciples of the Shinma peak, and his cultivation partner had a similar talent. She had luckily broken through the heavenly arrival state a few years ago, but her cultivation state was still a bit unstable. Did they want to ascend as well? Ping Yongka said awkwardly, "Big brother, big sister." The peak master of Yushan felt a bit embarrassed, standing behind Yuan Chu. Yuan Chu's face turned gloomy, looking a bit like Yuan Qijing's solemn countenance back then, but his words and actions were much more shameless than his granduncle's. "It's because we have ordinary talent that we are the most qualified to sign up," he said. Though what he said sounded a bit shameless, it was actually quite sensible. If everybody could ascend, why would they need to build this great formation of heavenly arrival? To put it on display? In the next moment, something unexpected happened. The suppressed screams broke out among the peaks, especially those who still remembered the events of the past, feeling sentimental. A man wearing a bamboo hat walked up to the black jade plate from beneath a distant tree. When Jing Jiu ascended more than 500 years ago, he was standing under that tree. Today, he was here again. Without waiting for Ping Yongka to ask, he took off his conical hat and revealed his slightly green face. He squinted and said, "Zhenren Jingyang still owes me a few bottles of antidote. I have to get it back. Besides, if I wait another 200 years, I might really be in danger." All right, he was threatening him with his life. What else could Ping Yongka say? There was no end to the discussion among the peak. It was obvious that some disciples of the righteous path were still unhappy. This heaven-connecting great array had gathered the resources of various sections. It was only the first time it was activated, but it had already been occupied by this evil demon. Not everyone could accept this. Su Zai rolled his eyes and looked away from the peaks, exuding a dreadful energy as he asked gloomily, "Who's not convinced? Don't get angry. It's not good for your health." A hand landed on his shoulder and patted lightly. Su Zai turned his head around expressionlessly, wondering who dared act so rudely with Ping Yongka standing in front of him. Yet, it occurred to him immediately that someone could sneak up behind him undetected. It was a middle-aged man wearing an ordinary cloth, with a sword tied to his waist. It was hard to tell whether it was good or bad. The expression on Su Zai's face changed slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching a few times, but he didn't say anything. In fact, besides Ping Yongka, nobody present had discovered the arrival of the middle-aged man. It was truly unbelievable. The shocked discussions broke out among the peaks, followed by the sounds of people bowing to him. Everybody stood up, and the disciples of the No Mercy sect were even more excited. "Greetings, Mr. Peng De." He was the sect master of the No Mercy sect, Peng Lang. In fact, he was the #1 swordsman of the human race. It was because the Snow Girl and Ping Yongka couldn't be considered as humans. The expression on Ping Yongka's face changed slightly as he looked at Peng De. "Did she agree to let you leave?" The Queen of the Snowy Kingdom had a daughter many years ago, but she couldn't ascend and leave like her mother. It was because she was the ruler of Chaotian, and she would suffer the backlash of this world if she left. Even the great formation of heavenly arrival might not work, and it might even cause the formation to disintegrate. The reason her mother was able to leave back then was because Jing Jiu had planned ahead of time and made use of the passage opened by the fairy lady Bai Ren. The current queen of the Snowy Kingdom couldn't leave Chaotian unless another fairy lady came to the world. In the sky far away from Aoyama, there was a cloud with countless ice crystals on its surface, glistening under the morning sunlight. A young woman with a small figure stood on the cloud. Countless white gauzes hung down from the edge of her conical hat, covering her feet, but they couldn't conceal her plump figure and dreadful cold intent. Pring Lang pulled back his gaze from the cloud in the distance and explained to Ping Yongka with a bitter expression, "She wants me to go out and catch a fairy lady for her." Ping Yongka felt sympathetic when he heard this, and patted his shoulder to comfort him. Soon, he felt something was off, saying, "If you wanted to go out, you would have done so a long time ago. Why wait until today?" Pring Lang explained earnestly, "It'll be much easier to go out with this formation." Ping Yongka said, "You don't look like the most powerful swordsman of the human race. What did my master teach you after talking to you for a whole night at the 3000 nunnery? Are you lazy?" Pring Lang let out a faint smile, but didn't explain further this time. Su Zai couldn't help but glance at Ping Yongka, wondering if he was lazy and sleepy instead of sleeping on the sword peak every day. He was not like that guy Zhuoruzhui. The gentle wind drifted over from the peaks, blowing away the remaining fog on the black jade plate. The last petal on the peach branch quivered slightly in the wind, as if it would fall off at any moment. Ping Yongka glanced at it and calculated the time. As he was about to activate the formation, he suddenly saw a small sedan with green curtains flying over from the distant morning sunlight. "You didn't inform me of such an important event." An angry voice burst out from inside the sedan. No sooner had the voice finished speaking than a petite woman, wearing a black royal robe, glided to the front of the black jade plate with a dignified bearing. She didn't wait for Ping Yongka's explanation before she scolded him while pointing at his nose, "You just didn't want me to ascend." Seeing this scene, it was quiet among the peaks. There was no sound of discussion, nor was there an uproar. Ping Yongka had a special background and status, and his cultivation state was exceedingly high. It was because the Queen of the Snowy Kingdom didn't kill Peng Lang back then, because he was by her side. Who in the whole world dared to be so rude to him? It could only be Apiao, the current king of the underworld. Though Apiao's cultivation state was far inferior to Ping Yongka's, it wasn't the case. The two of them had quarreled for hundreds of years over the title of being the personal disciple of the immortal Jingyang. Ping Yongka was unwilling to yield to her, but he was obviously in the wrong. As such, he had no choice but to yield to her in other aspects. Once he yielded to her, the underworld river would surge unceasingly. If the young senior master was the most outstanding figure in many stories, then the young sister was the one who was naturally favored. Nobody could do anything to stop her, just like what happened to Nan Wang. It was the same that day. Ping Yongka didn't get angry even when Apiao pointed at his nose and scolded him. He kept on explaining that his master had asked him to manage Chaotian back then, so he wouldn't go out, but he asked her to manage the underworld, so how could she leave at will? He didn't need to hurry. He could wait for the next boat. He had finally calmed down Apiao after a long time and a great deal of persuasion. Apiao grunted twice, but didn't give him a hard time. She said to Yuan Chu, "Tell your master to take good care of my item and find a way to return it to me as soon as possible. If it's damaged, I'll make trouble for her, my family." It was until now that she thought that Zhao Leia borrowed the seal of the king of the underworld for her own use. She didn't expect that it had already fallen into the hands of Lu Shisui. The Emperor Jing Cheng listened to the conversation from a distance, hesitating to say something. He also wanted to ask Yuan Chu to tell Zhao Lei to take good care of the first child's sword after his ascension, in case anything happened to it. However, his status was too low, and Yuan Chu was his grandmaster, so he didn't dare say anything. The ocean of clouds in front of the cliff had dispersed. They could see the peaks of Aoyama and the bustling scene on the other side clearly. They could even vaguely see the faint sword wills from the ground to the sky. The silver coals in the small stove emitted a red glow, but they were covered by the snow-like dust on the surface, which had a special sense of beauty. It would be better if it were in winter. The tea in the iron kettle was boiling, giving off a gurgling sound. Standing by the cliff's edge, Gu Qing looked at the location of the former Shangda Peak in silence. It was unclear what he was thinking about. For some reasons, they couldn't show up in front of the cultivation circle, so they had been watching from the Shinma Peak. Empress Hu picked up the iron kettle and filled up Jing Tao's cup first and then her own cup. Finally, she filled up Jing Cheng's cup and walked to his side. Gu Qing thanked her and raised the cup to his lips to take a sip. He found that the quality of the tea was the same as that of Brother Li's daughter-in-law. On second thought, he remembered that Brother Li's daughter-in-law and Brother Li had left a long time ago, and Jing Yao was now in the Guoqing temple. He couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. Empress Hu didn't think too much. She looked into the distance and asked curiously, why did they build such a heavenly formation? Half a year ago, the Zhongzhou school received the latest news from the outside world. Tong Yen said that something had happened and asked us to send more people out, Gu Qing said. Empress Hu now knew the reason. She couldn't help but mock. Why does it sound like a gang fight in Jianghu? One side couldn't defeat the other, so they came back to send more people. Gu Qing said with a smile, that's basically what happened. The magic treasures that were to be taken away were like machetes. Jing Tao also walked over and said, we don't need so many people. Mr. Pringde alone is enough. Gu Qing shook his head and said, my master was in danger, so he had to go to the snow girl. Even they couldn't solve the problem together. Pringde could only help a little. Jing Tao turned to look at him, a baffled expression in her eyes. Why didn't you go? She asked. Even though 500 years had passed, the cultivation circle in Chaotian hadn't forgotten that Gu Qing was a disciple of 36 filial piety. He had only disobeyed the immortal Jingyang once in his life regarding the elopement. Now that he knew that his master was in trouble in the fairy world, he must be anxious and eager to go and help. Though I've never neglected cultivation in my life, my talent is limited and my fighting prowess is not strong enough. Even if I went to the fairy world, I would only cause trouble for my master. Gu Qing didn't tell her all the reasons why he didn't go. What about Yuan Chu and Yushan? They went there for sightseeing. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.